But since I lied to them, they spent all that time searching for her.
That was a clip of a man named Phil Snyder, and what he didn't know was that at that moment, he was speaking to an undercover police officer who was investigating his missing wife, Roberta. At the ripe age of 73, most folks are settling into their comfy chairs, possibly contemplating the joys of retirement, not plotting sinister deeds. However, Philip's golden years took a dark turn that left many scratching their heads. Phil had originally claimed Roberta had succumbed to cancer during a sentimental journey to Elvis Presley's Graceland, but as the plot thickened, his story underwent several dramatic revisions. It started with an alleged death by choking near Graceland.
My wife passed away. She choked on a phlegm. She'd been choking for about a year.
Morphed into a mysterious disappearance on an Ohio bridge, and finally culminated in a confession prompted by an undercover operation over cups of coffee.
Did you feel any guilt?
In a way, kinda. I didn't tell anybody.
He confessed to killing his wife with a hammer and disposing of her body along the route to Memphis. Despite his confession, Roberta's remains were never recovered, believed to have ended up in a Kentucky landfill. Philip Snyder now serves his time in Ohio, which is a very chilling end to a twisted tale of deceit.
Alright, this one is insane. This guy accidentally confessed to killing 2 women during the filming of an HBO documentary. He'd gone to the bathroom and wasn't aware that his mic was still on. Anyway, context. In 1982, Robert Durst's wife, Kathy, went missing. He told police they'd gotten into an argument before she left their Westchester County home, but 5 days later, he reported her missing. There was no sign of her. And then on Christmas Eve, all the way up until 2000, Durst's friend Susan Berman was found dead in her LA home. Apparently, she had some knowledge of Kathy's disappearance and was going to be speaking with police. Durst was the one responsible for both killings. He also killed his neighbor Morris Black in 2001, which he was immediately arrested for, but he was acquitted because he was able to convince the court that it was in self-defense, even though Black had been found hacked to pieces floating in Galveston Bay. Now, he wasn't arrested for killing his wife and friend until 2015. Although there had always been suspicion that he'd been the one responsible. After finishing up his interview for the HBO docuseries The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, he walked into the bathroom not knowing his mic was still on and started mumbling to himself. And what he mumbled was about as incriminating as it gets.
What the hell did I do? Kill them all. Of course.
Ivan Robert Marco Malat, often called the Backpacker Killer, was an infamous Australian serial killer whose actions stunned the nation. Born in 1944 in a large family, Malat's life took a dark turn very early on. He exhibited disturbing behaviors, including a penchant for violence that escalated into a series of petty crimes and stints in jail. Malat's notoriety stems primarily from the late 80s to the early 90s, when he preyed on unsuspecting backpackers, luring them under the pretense of giving them a lift along the Hume Highway. These encounters tragically ended in the secluded depths of the Belanglo State Forest, where Malat would turn from a seemingly helpful driver into a ruthless killer. His gruesome spree included taking the lives of 2 men and 5 women, but Malat's reign of terror likely extended beyond those confirmed victims. What really tipped the scales towards his capture was an almost accidental confession. In a terrifying encounter, a British backpacker named Paul Onions barely escaped Malat's grasp. This pivotal moment came when Onions, hitchhiking, accepted a ride from him, but as they neared the forest, Malat's demeanor shifted menacingly as he brandished a weapon. In a desperate bid for his life, Onions managed to escape and later provided the police with crucial details about his attacker. While in an interrogation, the police asked Ivan about the suspect wearing gloves, to which he started to explain that he never wore gloves before he realized his slip-up.
William Corzon had been married to his wife Gloria since 1967, and it was a tumultuous relationship to say the least. William was physically violent with Gloria and would often threaten her life. In fact, he was even arrested for threatening to kill her in '67 and spent a bit of time in a mental institution. But when he got out, things didn't get any better. In fact, they got worse. And it all culminated in Gloria going missing in 1981. Gloria's family pretty much knew William had killed her. Police even suspected him of it, but they just didn't have enough physical evidence to put him behind bars, so he got off scot-free for a few decades anyway. In 2019, the case was reopened though, and when investigators contacted Corazon, he immediately asked them, "Did you find the body?" Now, authorities figured there was a very good chance that she was dead, but it was still being treated as a missing persons case. So that question, plus the years of domestic violence, gave police everything they needed to take him into custody, where he finally confessed to killing Gloria way back in 1981.
As we have clearly seen, real criminals occasionally trip up in ways that fiction just cannot beat. But in this case, it might be one of the most shocking. The case of Anthony Garcia, a real-life offender whose love for tattoos turned into his downfall. Back in 2008, Garcia was nabbed during a routine traffic stop, leading to what seemed like an ordinary arrest and mugshot. However, on closer inspection, the police spotted something extraordinary. His chest tattoo was not just any ink, it was a detailed map of a crime that he had committed in 2004. This wasn't just any tattoo, it was an intricate portrayal of a scene where he had taken a life, complete with the location and the exact way the victim had fallen. The ink practically served as a confession on skin, but it didn't end there. An undercover officer managed to get Garcia to spill more details, sealing his fate with his own artwork.
This next guy was so close to getting away with killing his wife, but right when he was about to get up and leave the interrogation room, the investigator managed to get him to talk. So in November of 1981, Evelyn Mackey disappeared from her Florida home. Her husband, Merle Mackey, told her family that she'd gone to Ohio to care for her sick sister-in-law, but Merle's story didn't hold up and police became suspicious of him. There were some holes in his story. Unfortunately though, there just wasn't any physical evidence or clear crime scene to explain Laverne's disappearance, and the case went cold for over 3 decades. In 2014 though, the investigation into Laverne's case was reopened. Detectives believed that Laverne hadn't left voluntarily. They came up with a little ruse, fabricating a story about a plane crash in South America, claiming that they might have found Laverne's remains and that Merle was likely eligible for compensation. This is all to get Merle into the station to talk, obviously. Now, Merle maintained that he didn't know where Laverne was, but the detective just kept pressing him. And Merle was about to get up and leave, but then the detective switched gears. He reframed his questioning, saying that he believed Merle may have just made a mistake, and he was able to coax Merle into framing the incident as an accident that he was just too scared to report at the time. Under pressure, Merle changed his story, claiming Laverne hit her head and fell into the water while they were fishing. He had even admitted to tying an anchor to her body and watching her sink because he thought that she was dead and was afraid to seek help. But Merle unintentionally revealed more than he intended. He described Laverne's head wound as spurting, suggesting that she was still alive when he disposed of her. Laverne's body was never found, but Merle pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but he died in 2020 while serving his sentence.
The detectives who conduct interrogations tend to be exceptionally skilled people, and they need to pick up on even the smallest bit of information that could signify that the person in front of them might be being deceitful. And sometimes they don't even need to be super skillful because the guilty party just tells on themselves, even when they didn't mean to. This admission comes from an episode of the A&E show The First 48, when detectives were searching for those responsible for taking the life of Michael Hudson in a drive-by situation. While detectives had their suspect, Eric Edwards, in the interrogation room, he was denying any and all involvement before finally conceding that perhaps he was at the scene of the crime, but that he was just the driver. Detectives, of course, aren't buying this and decide to try and appeal to his human side by bringing up the victim and who he was. This is when Eric slips up.
I know who he is. His brother died 6 months ago.
Sure did.
His name Marcus, and the one I shot, his name Mike.
Yeah. That sounded like a full-blown confession to me. When the detective dives into what he said again, Eric tries to backtrack, but I think at that point, it was just a little too late.
You said the one I shot, alright? So
No, you said the one I shot.
Jay Roth, one little slip up, and he immediately became a suspect in the death of a woman named Linda Riley. She'd been reported missing by friends in February of 2012. Roth actually showed up at the police station on his own. He was a friend of Linda's and spoke to police as if he was a concerned friend. Now, at first, Police weren't really suspicious of him at all. He seemed genuinely concerned, and he was open with police, but then he made a mistake. The detective asked him at one point, "Do you think that maybe she just left?" And Roth said, "No, she wouldn't leave without her dogs."
No, she wouldn't leave without her dogs.
So it was at this point that Roth immediately became a suspect. He'd said that with a lot of confidence. It was clear that he knew her dogs were still in the house and that it was just her that was missing, but how would he have known that? Police then started questioning what kind of relationship Roth had with Linda. They'd been friends who would occasionally hook up, according to Roth, but over the course of the next few days, other friends of Linda would say that she'd started becoming fearful of Roth, who seemed to want to have this control over her. He'd also get violent with her on occasion. Well, authorities asked Roth if he'd do a polygraph test. He agreed, failed the test miserably, and finally confessed to having killed Linda, having hit her in an argument where she then fell down, hitting her head. Unfortunately, she never woke up.
In his twilight hours, James Brewer thought he was at death's door. Lying in his bed, a stroke rendering him painfully aware of his mortality, he decided it was time to unburden his soul from a secret that had haunted him for over 3 decades. Back in 1977, Brewer had found himself cuffed and questioned for a crime of passion, a fatal crime fueled by jealousy in Tennessee. But instead of facing the music, he bolted. With his wife, he slipped away to Oklahoma, adopting new identities and starting afresh. Fast forward to what Brewer believed were his final moments, he picked up the phone and confessed to the crime, hoping to clear his conscience before meeting his maker. Ironically, fate had other plans. Brewer survived. Now, instead of preparing for the afterlife, he was preparing for a courtroom drama, facing a trial for the 32-year-old crime. After being caught for the crimes, Brewer held a garage sale, sold everything, and with his wife drove back to Tennessee to turn himself in. There, he faced the possibility of the death penalty, which was a stark turnaround for someone who thought that he was on his way out.
Finally, we have a story I'm going to call the butt dial. Butt dials. One of the most embarrassing things you can do on your phone, not quite as bad as looking at someone's story on Instagram and seeing it was posted 16 seconds ago and immediately feeling like a creep, but still bad. But, pun intended, this may be the most unlucky butt dial in history. Or luckiest, depending on how you look at it. It all happened in Roswell, New Mexico. 2 people were arrested after unintentionally dialing 911 and discussing their crime on the phone. Aaron Burrell and Yvonne Thyberg were driving away after stealing a TV from a house when Burrell's phone accidentally called the police. The 911 dispatchers listened in on the conversation for nearly 45 minutes as the suspects openly talked about their crime. At one point, one of them even said, "We basically robbed them, dude." And then another was like, "We got away safe and clean." And you can't make this up, as the two are revealing all the details of their crime. They were listening to Bon Jovi's Wanted Dead or Alive. Just cherry on top.
Okay, starting off our list today, we have Harold Shipman, aka Dr. Death. He was, as the name implies, a doctor practicing in the UK between the years 1972 and 1998. During his time as a physician, Shipman developed a great fondness for 2 things: pethidine, a synthetic opiate, and death. Not his death, of course, but the death of his patients. During his time in the medical field, Shipman caused the deaths of at least 218 patients, but the real number is likely much higher. He ended their lives by administering lethal doses of morphine, and for a long time his reign of terror went unnoticed. It wasn't until his addiction to substance abuse came to light that he was suspected to also have an addiction to killing. Based on the sheer number of patients who were just dropping dead in his care, hospital staff finally came to the realization that something was just not right. He was arrested after the daughter of one of his victims caught him trying to write a will for the victim, claiming him as the beneficiary. He got too greedy. He was convicted in 2000 and died in 2004 after taking his own life in prison. The motive for his crimes remains unknown, but many people have speculated that he took the lives of those he personally saw as being a burden to society, which makes the way he died pretty fitting if you ask me.
Next on the list we have Nanny Doss. Nanny Doss was given the nickname the Giggling Granny, and when you hear about what she did, that nickname is gonna take on a much more sinister tone than, it might sound. Nanny Doss appeared to be this loving and caring woman, but beneath her friendly facade, there was something much darker. Over the course of several decades, Doss committed a string of killings. She poisoned 4 husbands, her own mother, sister, and even her grandchildren. Her method of choice? Poison. Doss used deadly substances like arsenic and rat poison to carry out her crimes, all while maintaining this outwardly nurturing persona that kept suspicion at bay for years. I mean, who on earth would suspect a sweet old granny of taking the lives of her own family members? It's just icky. It wasn't until 1954 that authorities began to unravel the truth behind the deaths that seemed to follow Doss wherever she went. Traces of poison were discovered in the victims' bodies, leading to Doss's eventual arrest. In 1955, Nanny Doss pleaded guilty to having taken the life of her 5th husband and was handed a life sentence behind bars. But her tale didn't end there. In 1963, she shocked the world once again by confessing to her other crimes, providing chilling details about her methods. Doss spent the remainder of her days confined to a prison cell. She died in 1965.
Next up, we have H.H. Holmes, yet another really bad dude. A pharmacist who purchased a hotel only to turn it into a mansion, only to use that mansion as a gruesome playground designed to inflict enormous amounts of mental and physical pain and distress on anyone unlucky enough to walk through its doors. It was affectionately referred to as the Killing Castle. The building was equipped with trapdoors, gas chambers, and a basement crematorium. The exact number of people who died at the hands of H.H. Holmes is unknown, but the numbers are said to be in the hundreds. Holmes himself claimed to have ended the life of 27 individuals, but only 9 were confirmed by law enforcement. I feel like I'm leaning towards the hundreds for this guy. I mean, he took the trouble of converting an entire 3-story building into some kind of disturbing torture chamber. Yeah, I can't say that word either.
Next up, we have one of the creepiest cult leaders in history, Roch Thériault. Roch Thériault was the twisted leader of a cult known as the Anthill Kids, which he founded in Canada in 1977. Under his manipulation, Thériault's followers were convinced that he possessed divine powers and that they would be the chosen survivors of an impending apocalypse. Eventually, the group isolated themselves from the outside world, creating a closed, secretive community. Behind the guise of spiritual enlightenment, Roch subjected his followers to extreme physical and psychological torment. He enforced strict and very bizarre rules, becoming increasingly erratic in his behavior over time. He became more violent and controlling, inflicting harm on his followers in the name of discipline and purification. Some cult members even went through waking amputations. This guy actually claimed to possess magical powers that he believed could reattach severed limbs. His reign of terror eventually resulted in the death of one of his many wives. He was arrested, but somehow got a light sentence, and after his release, he went right back to doing what he was doing before and was rearrested. He died in prison at the hands of another inmate.
Something smells fishy. Albert Fishy. Well, actually Albert Fish. I'm gonna stop now. Albert Fish was a man of many names, among them the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Gary Man, the Boogeyman, you get it, man. Fish was a terrible person, as are all of the people on this list. His crimes consisted of stealing, violating, killing, and eating young men and women. When he was caught, he actually admitted that he would drink young people's BLOOD and make their body parts into stew. He was disgusting and seriously in the head. Again, like everyone else on this list. At one point during his crime spree, he actually sent a letter to the mother of one of his young victims detailing his crimes and how it had taken him 9 days to consume the corpse. This guy makes me sick. He was found guilty of killing 3 young people, although he claimed the number to be closer to 100. He died via electric chair on January 16th of 1936 at the age of 65. Thank God, good riddance, burn in hell.
Bradford Bishop. Worst thing about this guy is that he's still out there. I mean, he'd be about 88 years old now, so there's a good chance that he's dead. And he wouldn't be much of a threat now anyway, at that age, but his crime was so severe, it's just maddening that he never had to face the consequences. A former Foreign Services officer for the United States, Bishop decided to carry out a heinous crime on March 1st of 1976. Apparently, he'd been disappointed over not receiving a promotion at work. After informing his secretary that he wasn't feeling well, he left the office early, stopped at a bank, took out cash, then went to the hardware store. He bought a pitchfork, a shovel, and a can of gasoline, which is not suspicious in the slightest. got back home around 8 p.m. and proceeded to take the lives of his wife, his mother, and his 3 sons. Afterward, he drove their bodies to a secluded wooded swamp, set them on fire before vanishing without a trace.
Moving right along, we have Ahmed Suraji, an Indonesian serial killer known as the Black Magic Killer. His killings began in 1986 after he claimed his late father appeared to him one night in a dream and demanded that Ahmed kill no less than 70 women. For the next 13 years, Ahmed was hell-bent on completing the task. He practiced witchcraft and lured many of his victims in with the promise that his magic would solve all of their problems. He brought them to a field and buried them up to the waist, which he told them was all part of his magical process. It wasn't. He killed them by forcibly restricting their airways, and after they died, he drank their spit before burying them completely. When he did this, he made sure the heads of the women always pointed towards his home. He believed that the placement of his victims along with the consumption of the women's saliva enhanced his powers. I don't know about all of that, but it for sure enhanced his psycho, in my opinion. In 1998, police discovered some of Ahmed's victims in the field, and he was arrested and convicted of 42 killings. One of his 3 wives, who were all sisters by the way, were arrested as well for being an accomplice to the killings. She was sentenced to life in prison while Ahmed was sentenced to death. In 2008, Ahmed was executed by firing squad. Much like Ahmed, they showed no mercy.
Alright, the next despicable prick on our list is Christopher Lee Watts. Pretty sure this guy could make anyone's stomach churn. A man who took the life of not just his wife, but his daughters as well. His totally innocent, trusting daughters who couldn't see a bad bone in their father's body. And on the outside, nobody else could either. Watts seemed like an upstanding, everyday, suburban family man, but that wasn't the case. Most of you know how the story goes. It was so shocking that people were completely horrified and dumbfounded. This became one of the most talked about criminal cases in recent history. And what sets this one apart is all the video footage we have, not just of the police questioning Watts right after he disposed of his entire family, not just the interrogation footage, but the footage of the everyday, seemingly happy parts of the Watts family's life as well before this whole incident. Like, how could this man, who seemed to have it all, a nice home, beautiful wife, 2 great daughters, how could he decide to end all of their lives just to start a new one with a different woman? It's as disturbing as it gets.
Next up, we have Yang Jinhai, a Chinese serial killer who was responsible for a lot of deaths. In 1988 and again in 1991, Yang was sentenced to labor camps for theft. In 1966, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for attempting to violate a young woman. He served 3 years before eventually being released in 1999. Bad idea. For the next 4 years, Yang killed at least 67 people and violated at least 23 women. Commonly, Yang would enter family homes in the dead of night and then kill each family member one by one, using axes, hammers, and shovels, and on many occasions he would violate the women in the family before ending their lives as well. His motive, other than being a sick piece of shite, revenge, because his girlfriend had broken up with him after learning about his theft and attempted violation charges. He blamed society, and because he was walking garbage, he took his anger out on those in positions he craved, married men and women along with their daughters and sons. He was eventually arrested on November 3rd of 2003 and was sentenced to death via firing squad. The execution took place on February 14th of 2004 and was most likely incredibly painful, but nobody feels bad about that.
Finally, we have a complete and total creep, as if the rest of the people on this list weren't. Issei Sagawa. This guy is most infamous for the killing of Renee Hardevelt in Paris in 1981. He didn't just take her life though, he also ate parts of her body. After being found unfit for trial by French medical experts in '83, Sagawa was sent to a psychiatric institution, but he was deported to Japan in 1984, where, to the shock of many, he was declared sane by Japanese authorities. French authorities had apparently failed to provide the necessary case files, so Sagawa just kind of walked. And not only did he escape incarceration, but he also went on to write a memoir titled In the Fog, where he recounted the details of his crime in detail. Very icky story.
Starting off our list today with Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. If you're from Canada, you probably know about this one, but this video is to educate our American friends. Name a worse duo. I'll wait. Paul Bernardo, aka the Scarborough Violator, and his wife Karla Homolka were involved in the violation of at least 14 women and the killing of 3 in Scarborough between the years 1990 and 1992. Nicknamed Ken and Barbie, Homolka was seen as Paul's assistant or partner in crime, if you will, as she often watched her husband violate their victims and sometimes even videotaped the events as well. Another thing that's absolutely insane is that one of these pair's victims was actually Karla Homolka's younger sister, Tammy Homolka. The pair used illicit substances to subdue Tammy, and unfortunately, while in her sedated state, she choked and died. When the pair were finally caught, Karla did a complete 180 and turned on Paul, testifying against him in exchange for a shortened sentence. She spent 12 years in prison for 2 counts of man 1, while Paul, on the other hand, got life with a minimum of 25 years starting in 1995. He actually did have a parole hearing earlier this year, but luckily and obviously it was denied. Karla, on the other hand, is free and living in Quebec. Oh, and she's actually married to her former lawyer's brother as well. Next up, we've got Robert Pickton, another popularly unpopular name here in Canada, but like Bernardo, believe it or not, I as a Canadian did not know about him until earlier this year. Might have something to do with the fact that I didn't grow up in Canada, but still. Anyways, Robert Pickton is straight up gross, like everyone else on this list, but hear me out. This guy violated and killed at least 26 women. I say at least because that's all the courts were able to prove, but he claims the number is actually 49, which he complained about after his arrest because he was so close to an even 50. Actually, what he really said is that he was angry, furious, and disappointed that he never got his big 5-0. By the way, this guy is eligible for parole in 2026, but I doubt he'll get it because besides the fact that he violated and killed a confirmed 26 women, after they died, he fed their bodies through a wood chipper and then fed it to his pigs, which I guess is why they call him the pig farmer. May he rot in hell. Next up, we've got Russell Johnson, aka the bedroom killer. Well, he was actually called the bedroom, something that rhymes with Wrangler, but I don't think YouTube will let me say that, so here we are. Yet another violator slash killer living in the Great White North, which despite this video, I promise isn't actually a bad place to be. Over the span of 4 years, Russell Johnson killed at least 8 women and violated at least 18. How? Well, I mean, the name kind of gives it away, but it's weirder than that. This guy also could have been known as the Lizard Man Killer because he was known to scale the outside walls of buildings to reach his victims, sometimes climbing many stories high to access the opened bedroom windows of unsuspecting women. Think you're safe because you're not living on the bottom floor? Think again, I guess. When he entered into the victims' homes, he would watch them sleep for a while before joining them in their beds, forcing their compliance in adult activity, and then forcibly restricting their airways. Luckily, he got caught. Unluckily, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, but thankfully, he was sentenced to life in a mental institution. So at least that's something. Next up, we have Clifford Olson Jr., a killer con artist who between the years of 1980 and 1981 took the lives of at least 11 individuals. Prior to the killings, Olson had been serving a sentence for crimes committed as a con artist, but he was released after working as an informant, providing officials with information about his cellmate, Gary Francis Marcoux. Ironically, Olson later attributed his future crimes and his interest in forcibly taking and killing people, some of which he violated, to the conversations he had had with Marcoux. Olson was rash and unorganized. After his release, he went into a frenzy, killing all 11 of his victims in the span of less than 1 year. His methods range from restricting airways to large blades to beatings. He was eventually arrested after trying to force 2 female hitchhikers into his car, and he was sentenced to life in 1981 and later died behind bars in 2011 at the age of 71. Once again, might I say, rotten hell. Next up, we've got Elizabeth Wettlaufer, an incredibly disturbed former nurse who either in a twisted way really loved or just really hated old people. Throughout her time working in elder care, she caused the deaths of 8 senior citizens and attempted to kill 6 others in Ontario between the years of 2007 and 2016. She was caught only after checking herself into a rehabilitation program at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, also known as CAMH. While seeking treatment, she resigned as a nurse and confessed her crimes to members of the hospital staff, who then reported her to the Ontario Nurses College, who then notified police. During During a taped 2-hour-long confession, Wetlaufer confessed to killing and attempting to kill patients under her care by injecting them with lethal or near-lethal doses of insulin. She also said that after injecting her patients, a voice inside of her would laugh, but she wasn't sure if she was being guided to kill by the devil or guided to spare the elderly from a slow death by God. She also passed a lot of gas while in the interrogation room, which is irrelevant, but I feel like worth mentioning. She was sentenced to 8 concurrent life terms in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, and thankfully remains behind bars to this day. Next up, Michael Wayne McGray. On May 1st of 1985, McGray killed his first victim, a hitchhiker in Nova Scotia. Then in 1987, he impaled and killed his alleged accomplice in the first crime. I'm telling you guys, no honor amongst thieves, or killers in this case. In the years that followed, while in and out of prison for various other crimes, McGray went on to kill a confirmed 5 more individuals. However, he claims to have ended the lives of at least 4 others, but that was never proven. In 2000, McGray was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the death of both Kimberly Ann, who he killed in St. John, New Brunswick in 1999, and Joan Nix, who died at McGray's hands in Moncton in 1998. As I said, he was sentenced to 20 years, but during that time, he killed a fellow inmate, Jeremy Phillips, causing his sentence to increase to life. Wayne Clifford Bodden is next on our list today, also known as the Vampire Violator. Between the years of 1969 and 1971, the deranged lunatic took the lives of 4 women, 3 in Montreal and 1 in Calgary. So why was he called the Vampire Violator? Well, he had a bit of a calling card. At the scene of each one of Bodden's crimes, very distinct bite marks had been left on the intimate chest areas of his victims' bodies. While biting someone so hard it leaves behind a fully trackable orthodontic footprint is absolutely horrendous, it ended up being exactly what police needed to track the guy down. Wayne Bodden became the first killer in North America to be convicted based on forensic dental evidence. For his crimes, Bodden was given 4 life sentences to be carried out in the Kingston Penitentiary in Kingston, Ontario. His sentence started on February 16th of 1972 and ended on May 27th of March 2006 when he died in the Kingston General Hospital of skin cancer. Next up, we've got Peter Woodcock, who after his arrest actually changed his name in prison to David Michael Kruger. This guy was not just incredibly sadistic and disturbed, but also literally crazy. In Toronto in 1956, Peter set out on his bicycle surrounded by an imaginary army of 500 other invisible boys on bikes who he believed to be real. While cycling around the exhibition place, he met a young man. Peter then lured the young man to a secluded area of the grounds and restricted his airways until he died. After that, Peter went on to kill 2 other people, one in a way so horrific it could rival the acts of the devil. Seriously? This guy. Sorry. It's true. Luckily, he was arrested before continuing his streak, but he was ultimately found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was, however, diagnosed as a psychopath and sent to a maximum security mental health center. During his time at the center, he was treated with various methods, including LSD therapy. Also, during his time there, for some reason, he was given a day pass, which he used to kill a former inmate because, as he claimed, the alien gang known as the Brotherhood wanted him to. He wasn't given any more day passes after that, and he eventually died in the facility at the age of 71. Next up, we've got Russell Williams, a former colonel in the Canadian military who in 2010 was charged with 2 counts of killing in the first degree, 2 counts of forcible confinement, 2 counts of breaking and entering, multiple counts of forcing women to do adult activity with him, and 82 other counts related to breaking and entering. I mean, this guy was given a rap sheet to rival all other rap sheets. For you Americans, it was probably longer than a CVS receipt, whatever that is. I've heard about it before. Anyways, Russell Williams was incredibly disturbed, obviously. Not only did he violate and kill women, he also often stole their lingerie. When he was caught, he was given 2 life sentences, which he is currently serving in a maximum security prison located in Port Cartier, Quebec. Speculation that Russell's wife was aware of his behaviors circulated around the courts in 2014, but she maintains that she was completely oblivious to his crimes until his arrest in 2010. And finally, we have Leopold Dion, who in 1963 violated 20 21 young men and killed 4. Nicknamed the Monster of Pont Rouge, after his first act of violation, he attempted to kill a woman with his brother. The two violated her on the railroad tracks of a village in Quebec before impaling her with a large blade and leaving her to die. She survived, but maintained serious physical and psychological injuries from the ordeal. After that, Leopold worked alone. He posed as a photographer to lure in young men, meeting them in public and snapping a few photos on a camera with no film before telling them that he wanted a change of scenery and driving them to abandoned areas to be killed. After Dion was caught, it took him an entire month to confess to his crimes, during which time he led officers to the spot in which he had buried his victims' bodies. Surprisingly though, he was only charged with 1 killing, but it really didn't matter, I suppose, as he was still given the ultimate sentence: death. However, the sentence was later commuted to life in prison. However, on November 17th, he was impaled to death by a fellow inmate who was not charged in the killing of Dion due to reason of insanity. Wild ride. Starting off our list today, we have Tommy Smith. On February 24th of 2015, Smith, who by that time already had a pretty extensive criminal record, attempted to steal 65-year-old Peter Cherm's Range Rover from his driveway. When Cherm stepped in to protect his property, Tommy snapped. He pulled out a large blade and began impaling Peter in the head, back, neck, chest, and arms with such frenzied force that the 8-inch weapon snapped in 2. Surprisingly, Peter did survive the attack, but he lost sight in one eye and suffered a stroke as a result. Smith fled the scene after Peter's son emerged from his home, but he was arrested soon after, at which time he refused to answer any questions, but did deny the charge of attempted killing on the grounds of insanity. When Smith went to trial, he maintained this stance, telling the Crown that he was not responsible for injuring Peter Cherm, as he had been possessed by a demon at the time of the encounter. While members of the court didn't buy Tommy's story of demonic possession, they did recognize the fact that he had been previously diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. He avoided charges of attempted killing and was instead charged with grievous bodily harm and burglary. He was sentenced to live out the rest of his days in a secure mental hospital that caters to the criminally insane. This next incident took place in 1974 when family man Michael Taylor, a non-religious and previously well-tempered and happy man, joined a Christian fellowship group in the small town of Ossett in West Yorkshire, England. Soon after Taylor joined the organization, he became rather irritable and ill-tempered, and many members of the town began to suspect that he was cheating on his wife with Marie. The town's suspicions were confirmed after the pair were found naked together, and it was at that time that Taylor claimed he had been possessed by an evil presence. A local vicar was called to perform an all-night exorcism, during which the vicar claimed to have expelled a total of 40 different demons. After the performance, the vicar decided to take a much-needed rest, but the problem with this was that, according to him, Taylor still had 3 demons left: killing, violence, and insanity. Shortly after the vicar left, Taylor was found covered in BLOOD, which he claimed belonged to Satan himself. It did not belong to Satan, but rather his wife Christine, who was later found dead in the Taylor home. Michael was ultimately found not guilty by reason of insanity. Next on our list today, we have Jason Dalton, an Uber driver who believed that the devil was hiding in his Uber app. He claimed that whenever he opened the app, he would be greeted with symbols of Satan, including the Eastern Star and the devil himself. He further believed that through the app, he himself had become possessed, which ultimately led him to take the lives of 6 individuals during a killing spree on February 20th of 2016, in which he fired projectiles at his victims using a handheld weapon. Dalton was arrested and taken into custody, where during an interview he said, "You guys are gonna have a hard time believing this, but it literally took over my mind and body," in reference to the app. Dalton pled guilty to the killings and was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes, but remained silent and remorseless throughout his trial, as he did not believe his wrongdoings were of his own volition. Next, we have the Yaroslav Satanists, a group of 6 Satanists living and committing crime in Russia in 2008. The group claimed to have carried out the killings of 4 individuals as a way to provide for Satan. Each of the bodies found were in foul condition, dismembered with their belongings missing. When the group was investigated, it came to light that before human killings, the Satanist gang, led by Nikolai Ogolobiak, had previously performed several animal sacrifices in preparation. The group also admitted to consuming parts of their victims as part of an initiation ritual and in an effort to please the Antichrist. In June of 2010, the group was persecuted in a closed trial, and Nikolai was sentenced to 20 years in Russian prison on charges of robbery, killing, and desecration of the deceased. Surprisingly, the other 5 members of the group, 4 men and 1 woman, were given sentences that ranged from just 8 to 10 years. It really seems like the justice system might have failed on this one. At our halfway point today, we are keeping things kind of light and talking about a celebrity that claims to have sold their soul to the devil, Lil Uzi Vert. Say that 5 times fast. No, really. The faster you say it, the more Lil Uzi Vert starts to sound a bit like Lucifer. In fact, in Lil Uzi's Endless Fashion released in 2023, they actually began the song by saying that they sold their soul. The devil can also be seen tattooed across the American rapper's chest, who frequently wears upside down crosses and uses satanic references and images in their music career. In an interview at a red carpet event, Lil Uzi was also recorded claiming that their hit song, I Just Wanna Rock, was hypnosis. In another song, For Me, Lil Uzi says, I made a city girl believe in Satan. While the rapper maintains that they are in fact not a Satanist, the phrases and imagery used in their artistry seems to be a blatant admission of Lil Uzi's relationship with the devil. Oh, and they're also known to be quite close with well-known Satan worshipper Marilyn Manson, but hey, who knows, right? I do, however, want to know what you guys think, so go ahead and let me know in the comments. As always, I will be sure to take a look. Moving past our halfway point today, we have Sean Sellers, a Satanist who regularly drank his own BLOOD. He claims that his fondness for the Antichrist came to him at a young age, with many believing his claimed connection to Satan to have been fostered by the man's rough upbringing. Sean was born to a young mother and an alcoholic father who abandoned the family short after. Throughout his life, his mother, who had remarried, and his grandfather were often physically violent towards Sean, and it seemed that on March 5th of 1986, he'd finally had enough. Sean, who had been involved in satanic cult rituals at the time, stripped down to his underwear and entered the bedroom of his mother and stepfather. He fired a projectile from a handheld weapon into both of their faces and staged the crime scene to make it seem as though the killings had been the result of a robbery gone wrong. It soon came to light that a year prior to the death of Sean's parents, the young man had killed a convenience store clerk in a similar fashion after being unable to purchase alcohol at the location. Sellers was convicted of the 3 killings and sentenced to death. During his time in prison, Sellers renounced Satan and lived as a born-again Christian until his execution on February 3rd of 1999. Next, we have Antoine Rose, a witch who lived in the 1470s and claimed to have not only worshipped the devil, but to have met him as well. In 1477, Antoine was put on trial for witchcraft, during which time she explained that she had come to know the devil after her neighbor introduced her to an occult group that would promise her a solution to her financial struggles. The solution? Worship the devil and ask for his help in exchange for your soul. The devil first appeared to Rose in the form of a man named Robinette. He gifted her gold and silver, a stick, and a jar filled with lotion. She was instructed that whenever she needed to get in contact with the devil, all she had to do was use the lotion, hop on the stick, and say go in the devil's name. Throughout her time spent worshipping the devil, Rose often paid homage to her leader by dancing, feasting, and stepping on symbols of God in the form of communion wafers. Rose also said that on many occasions the devil, whose voice she described as hoarse and dark, had shifted into a black dog in front of her and instructed her to kiss his. Next up, we have the story of possessed killer Arne Johnson. On July 3rd of 1980, Johnson's son David woke up screaming. He told his parents that he had seen a demon in his dreams with sharp teeth, pointed ears, and cloven hooves. Because David had not been exposed to horror movies and rarely experienced nightmares, the Johnson family took young David's claims quite seriously. And even more seriously in the weeks that followed. David had been experiencing more and more nightmares involving the same demon, and bruises and scratches began to appear all over David's skin. Eventually, the family called Ed and Lorraine Warren, who arranged for an exorcism to be performed on David, after which life for David went back to normal. For a while, that is. Because in 1981, David's father, Arn, impaled a landlord with a pocket blade, killing the man after the two had gotten into an argument. When Arn was arrested, he said that he was possessed by the demon that once inhabited his son, claiming that during the exorcism he had told the demon to enter his body so that David would be freed of the burden. These claims were actually backed by audio evidence, recordings taken at the time of the exorcism, as well as the testimonies of Ed and Lorraine. Johnson was convicted for his crime but was released after 5 years for exemplary behavior, a decision that was supported by state authorities. Starting off our top two, we have Clara Seal, a young woman who in 1906 entered into a deal with the devil. Seal made the deal after losing both of her parents at a young age, and while it's not clear exactly what the deal entailed, just a few short weeks after the pact had been made, Seal was seen ripping apart her own clothes while speaking in tongues and making strange sounds that appeared to be coming from her gut rather than her vocal cords. It was clear to onlookers that she had been possessed by a demon. An exorcism was performed during which Seal's skin began to boil after coming into contact with holy water, and her body levitated several times in front of 170 eyewitnesses. Seal was also seen writhing and squirming across the ground in a non-human fashion. The exorcism took 2 days to perform, and Seal almost died in the process, but it did appear to be successful, as after it was over, Seal was able to live out the rest of her days without any further signs of the once incredibly evident possession. And finally, we have David Berkowitz, the self-proclaimed son of Sam, a spree killer who took the lives of at least 6 individuals between 1976 and 1977. While law enforcement believes that Berkowitz chose his victims at random, the son of Sam had a different explanation. He claimed that he had been listening to Sam, a demon who had possessed his neighbor's Labrador retriever. Berkowitz said that the dog would often speak to him, telling him who to kill. Berkowitz's claims were accompanied by a note that had been left at one of the crime scenes prior to his capture that alluded to Father Sam, who drinks BLOOD and commands death. It is unclear whether or not David Berkowitz came up with the story as a way to perpetuate the idea that his mental state made him unfit for trial, but he never pled insanity. In fact, he pled guilty to his crimes, and not only that, but he also left the note referring to Sam at the crime scene long before his capture. So, what do you guys think?
The Servant Girl Annihilator, the Austin Axe Killer, the Midnight Assassin, these were all names given to one of the earliest serial killers in the United States, an unidentified assailant who terrorized Austin, Texas between 1884 and 1885, 3 years before Jack the Ripper. The killer would attack his victims while they slept in their beds, hacking them up with an axe. The majority of his victims were mainly black women. The spree only stopped when additional police were hired to patrol the streets at night and residents formed their own vigilance committee. In total, the Servant Girl Annihilator was responsible for 8 deaths. He also severely injured 6 other women and 2 men. But the killer was never caught or identified. There were all kinds of theories floating around at the time. Some local voodoo practitioners believed that he had the power of invisibility, because no dogs in the homes or surrounding areas where he'd attacked had barked. He seemed to just almost move entirely silently. And in 1888, after Jack the Ripper had killed Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, another theory came about that the Austin Axe Killer and Jack the Ripper were actually the same guy. Carl Eugene Watts isn't a name that usually comes up in the lists of the worst American serial killers in history, but he's actually one of the most prolific. Born in 1953 in Killeen, Texas, Watts began his spree in 1974. He'd kidnap his victims from their homes and torment them for prolonged periods before finally killing them, usually by strangulation, bludgeoning, or drowning. Most of his victims were young white women, who he described later in court as having, quote, evil eyes. He'd attack in different jurisdictions, often crossing into different states. He became known as the Sunday Morning Slasher and operated for about 8 years before finally being caught. Police weren't able to connect him to every killing he was suspected of carrying out, which could be over 100, but he did receive a life sentence, dying in prison of prostate cancer in 2007. On December 13th, 1990, a lady of the night, Mary Lou Pratt, was found dead in the Oak Cliff neighborhood in Dallas. She'd been killed with a firearm. But the most disturbing part both of her eyes had been carefully removed. Then just 2 months later, another woman of the night, Susan Peterson, was found dead just outside of Dallas. Once again, her eyes had been carefully surgically removed. There was obviously a pattern now, and the assailant became one of the most wanted criminals in the state. Finally, just 1 month later, a third woman was found dead, lying on her side near a school. Once again, no eyes. A major breakthrough in the case came when a woman tipped off the police about a man named Charles Frederick Albright, who was known to have a strange fascination with eyes, and he'd also known the first victim, Mary Lou Pratt. A number of other courtesans said that Albright had been violent with them, so this was enough to get a search warrant. In Albright's home, police found that he'd removed the eyes from several photographs and dolls. He also had a history with the law going back to when he was just a teenager, mostly for robbery. He was only ever tied to one of these killings officially, but it's pretty clear he was responsible for all three. He was sentenced to life without parole and died in prison in 2020. Dean Corll, aka the Candy Man. He operated between 1970 and 1973, known to have killed a minimum of 28 young men in Houston and Pasadena. He'd lure his victims by offering them a ride, or he'd invite them to a party. Now, it's easy to say don't get into a car with a stranger, but the thing is, Corll would acquaint himself with a number of his victims before picking them up and taking them to his home, where he'd torment and kill them. And if he didn't know them himself, they'd be friends or acquaintances of his accomplices. Yeah, he didn't operate alone. He had two young men, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, helping him. Once his victims were in his home, he'd give them various substances until they'd pass out, then he'd handcuff them to his bed, have his way with them, or torment them until finally taking their lives. Sometimes this would be drawn out for days. Well, it finally came to an end when one of his accomplices, Elmer Wayne Henley, grabbed Corll's firearm and turned it on him. Henley told him, "You've gone far enough, Dean. I can't go on any longer. I can't have you kill all my friends." Corll began stepping towards Henley, daring him to shoot, not believing he would, but Henley did. Corll tried to run out of the room, but Henley fired 3 more times, killing him instantly. Good riddance. Janine Jones was a nurse who worked with young patients, and this makes her case incredibly disturbing because a nurse is just the last person you'd be expecting to intentionally cause you harm. She's believed to have caused the deaths of around 60 young patients between 1970 and 1982. She did this by administering unneeded substances like dioxin and heparin into her patients. She started her career at Bexar County Hospital in San Antonio, but people started getting suspicious when a larger than normal number of young patients were dying under her care. Now, instead of reporting her, the hospital just quietly kind of let her go to avoid bad publicity and potential lawsuits, which is insane. Then Jones found a job at a pediatrician's clinic in Kerrville. Luckily, her suspicious behavior didn't go unchecked there, though. A doctor discovered she had been accessing dangerous amounts of succinylmethonium chloride. Eventually, in 1985, she was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Joe Ball became known as the Butcher of Elmendorf and the Alligator Man. This case goes back to the 1930s in Texas. Joe Ball was a former soldier who turned to bootlegging after World War I and later opened a saloon when Prohibition ended. And behind his saloon, he kept a pond with 6 alligators, where he would sometimes feed them live cats and dogs for entertainment purposes. That's already evil on its own, but it seems it just wasn't satisfying Joe Ball's thirst for cruelty because things went even further. Women in the area, including his very own wife, began to disappear. In 1938, 2 county sheriffs came to question Ball about the missing women, and he panicked, ending his own life with a pistol. After Ball's death, his handyman Clifford Wheeler came forward and confessed to helping Ball dispose of the bodies of 2 women by feeding them to his alligators. It's suspected that Ball may have been responsible for the deaths of up to 20 women. Thank God this next guy was put to death. Anthony Allen Shore, a complete and utter sicko. He mainly operated in Houston, forcing himself on several young women and girls between 1986 in 1995. He would strangle his victims before dumping their bodies. He wasn't investigated until 1998 when he was convicted of harming his own 2 daughters. He was required to provide DNA to authorities who were then able to link him to victims of his then unsolved crimes. After 11 hours of interrogation, Shore had given authorities everything they needed. It took the jury less than an hour to decide to put Anthony Allen Shore to death, and in 2004, he was put down by lethal injection. Edward Harold Bell was born in 1939 in southern Texas. He was responsible for a long list of disturbing crimes, but most notably for having killed 11 girls throughout Houston, Galveston, Webster, and Dickinson between 1971 in 1977. He revealed these crimes in 1998 in a series of letters, which he sent to prosecutors in Galveston and Harris counties. The cases had been unsolved at the time, and the details Bell outlined matched the circumstances of the cases. The first killing Bell detailed took place in 1971. He killed 2 girls in Galveston, Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson, dumping their remains close to a deserted bridge. The 2 had been reported missing after accepting a ride from a man in a white van. At the time, Bell had owned a white van. Bell was never convicted for any of the killings he detailed in these letters, but he was already in prison for having killed a Marine named Larry Dickens, who had been attempting to restrain him after having flashed several young women from inside his car. And it's worse than that, but I can't really go into details here, nor would I really want to. Now, he'd actually managed to escape this incident and was a wanted fugitive. He wasn't caught until an episode of Unsolved Mysteries aired about the case, and someone who knew Bell tipped off the police. Angel Resendez, aka the Railroad Killer, was on the FBI's most wanted fugitives list before finally surrendering to Texas authorities on July 13th of 1999. He carried out at least 23 killings while train hopping across the southern US and Mexico between 86 and 99. Resendez would hop on freight trains traveling from one place to another and would often target people living near railway tracks. He would break into homes or attack people he encountered, leaving just a trail of violence in his wake. And what made Resendez particularly dangerous was his ability to evade capture, because he was constantly moving and crossing state lines. Law enforcement agencies across different states really struggled to coordinate and apprehend him. And an extra creepy thing about him was that he liked getting to know his victims after killing them, usually looking at their driver's licenses and other forms of ID, and then taking sentimental items from their homes. He was a real creep. His reign of terror finally ended in 1999, and he died of lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas in 2006. The Phantom of Texarkana, the Phantom Killer, the Phantom Slayer. He has many monikers, but his real identity is still a complete mystery. The Phantom Killer stalked young couples in the Texarkana region between February 22nd and May 3rd of 1946. Each attack targeted young couples in isolated spots on weekend nights. The attacks occurred every 3 to 4 weeks. In the first attack on February 22nd, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry were parked in a secluded area when a man wearing a white cloth mask approached them. He ordered them out of the car, hit Jimmy on the head with a firearm, and forced himself on Mary using the barrel of his firearm. Luckily, both Jimmy and Mary survived this attack. In the second attack on March 24th, Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were found dead in Griffin's car. They'd been shot outside the car and then placed back inside. The third attack on April 14th involved Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker. Martin was found shot multiple times. Booker was found shot twice, both with the same type of pistol used in the previous attack. The final attack on May 3rd resulted in the deaths of Virgil and Katie Starks in their home. Katie had actually taken 2 bullets to the face, but had managed to run out of the home and get help. That was the last attack, but not because the assailant was caught. For some reason, he just stopped. The case has never been solved. And we're starting off today's list with the Beer Man. In the late 2000s, India was gripped by fear as a mysterious assailant dubbed the Beer Man wreaked havoc in and around Mumbai. Operating between 2006 and 2007, the Beer Man took the lives of at least 6 homeless men. What makes this case particularly baffling is that to this day, the identity of the assailant is unknown. The modus operandi of the beer man involved bludgeoning his victims. The pattern was identified when beer bottles were found placed beside each of the bodies. The crimes terrified the community, especially among Mumbai's homeless population, who were the primary targets. There was no clear motive to the crimes, so piecing together a comprehensive profile or identity was a challenge. There were no concrete leads, witnesses, or forensic evidence to track down the perp. Several people were brought in for questioning during the course of the investigation, but none were definitively linked to the crimes. So this guy got off scot-free and it's likely still out there. If you're enjoying our channel so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We got videos coming at you on the daily, so don't miss out. Just subscribe. It's free. Next on the list, we have Valentina de Andrade, who was the leader of one of the most notorious cults in Brazil and is still alive and free today. In the late 80s and early 90s, Brazil saw the rise of a disturbing cult known as the Superior Universal Alignment, led by Valentina de Andrade. This group blended dark satanic elements with UFO beliefs. Can't say I've ever seen those two things used in the same sentence until now. Between 1989 and 1993, a series of alarming incidents occurred in Altamira, Brazil, where numerous young men either went missing or were found dead under incredibly violent circumstances. Authorities couldn't identify the culprit behind these crimes until two prime suspects revealed their affiliation with the Superior Universal Alignment. Valentina held an unusual belief that males born after 1981 were inherently evil based on contact with extraterrestrial beings who conveyed this message to her. Investigators probed into her involvement in the crimes, but insufficient evidence prevented her from facing any serious legal consequences. Four other members of the cult were convicted in connection with the violent acts, but Valentina fled to Argentina, where she still preaches her beliefs to this day. Number 8, the Honolulu Strangler. In the 80s, Honolulu faced a series of unsettling crimes attributed to an unknown perp, now commonly referred to as the Honolulu Strangler. Between 1985 and 86, this mystery strangler took the lives of at least 5 women. Even today, the Honolulu Strangler has never been identified or apprehended. The victims, all women, were discovered assaulted and strangled. There was a very clear pattern here that led authorities to suspect a serial assailant. There were intensive investigations, but all that's been left behind are a string of unsolved mysteries. The victims were completely random, aside from being women, of course, and there was no clear motive, so it was tough for investigators to anticipate the perpetrator's next move or establish a concrete profile. Forensic technology was also limited at the time, which of course further hindered the progress of the investigation. The case is still open, and unless the guy has died, he's still roaming around free. Next on the list is Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader, also known as BTK, just Google it, committed a series of heinous crimes that spanned from the 70s to the early 2000s. Rader took the lives of 10 people, primarily in Kansas. His victims were men and women, mostly women, ranging from young adults to seniors. He would stalk his victims before breaking into their homes. He would then bind and torment his victims. He'd also leave behind distinctive signatures at the crime scenes, like letters, drawings, or other personal items, taunting both law enforcement and the families of the victims. A chilling aspect of Rader's case was his communication with the media and authorities. He sent letters to local newspapers detailing the specifics of the crimes just to mess with people. In some instances, he even included items from the crime scenes as proof of his involvement. He went undetected for decades, and it wasn't until 2004 that advancements in forensic technology and the tracing of a floppy disk he'd sent to the police led to his arrest. In 2005, Rader pleaded guilty to his crimes and was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Charles Cullen was a former nurse who committed a series of crimes during his nursing career. He administered lethal doses of medications to patients under his care, leading to the deaths of an estimated 40 or more individuals, possibly even reaching into the hundreds. These incidents occurred across multiple hospitals, so it was challenging for authorities to notice the pattern. As for his motivations, it's not entirely clear. It is clear, though, that he did derive some form of satisfaction from exerting control over life and death. Fellow hospital staff eventually got suspicious of the sudden and unexpected deaths of patients under Cullen's care. His spree came to an end when he was arrested in 2003. He's currently serving 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole until 2403. The intricacies of the American justice system aside, the reality is that he'll thankfully never be released. Number 2, the Freeway Phantom. The Freeway Phantom is an unidentified assailant who terrorized Washington in 1971. This individual abducted 6 young women over the course of a year. The victims were subjected to violence, and their bodies were dumped along the highway. Notably, the victims were always found without shoes. In the case of the second to last victim, though, the Freeway Phantom left a fully dressed woman, including shoes, along with a note reading, "This is a tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me, if you can." Signed, the Freeway Phantom. And we're finishing off the list with the Stone Man. Between 1985 and 1989, a string of violent crimes happened in India, first in Bombay and later in Calcutta. These 26 deaths are believed to be connected. The initial cluster of deaths occurred in Bombay, targeting homeless men who were discovered brutally bludgeoned to death in their sleep, the weapon of choice being stones. The authorities began recognizing a pattern after the 6th victim, pointing to a potential serial assailant. But the identity of the perp is still unknown. It's unclear whether a single individual or a group or even copycat criminals were behind the violent crimes. Then things got worse. There were an additional 13 cases in Calcutta, which were collectively known as the Stone Man murders. The recurring theme persisted. All victims were homeless, and they died being bludgeoned to death with stones. There's still speculation as to whether the person responsible for the Bombay crimes extended their spree to Calcutta, or if it was a different culprit altogether. Authorities detailed several potential suspects, but there wasn't enough hard evidence to convict anyone, and they were eventually released.
Starting off this countdown, we have Eugene Palmer. Eugene Palmer is said to be the oldest man to make it on the FBI Most Wanted list. On September 24th of 2012, Eugene Palmer shot and killed his daughter-in-law, Tammy. Apparently, Eugene Palmer's son, John Palmer, was having a rough time with his relationship with Tammy. Eventually, they started seeing other people, and Tammy filed for a restraining order against John. This made Eugene very angry. Days before the murder, Eugene confronted Tammy and they had a huge argument. On the day of her murder, he shot her from a distance before fleeing in his truck, which was later found abandoned. Despite multiple searches, Palmer has never been found. The FBI is offering a reward of up to $100,000 to anyone who can provide helpful information leading to his arrest. In our 8th spot today, we have Victor Manuel Jarina. Victor Manuel is one of the longest criminals on the FBI's Most Wanted list. Victor was a car guard working for the Wells Fargo Express Company. On September of 1983, Victor arrived at work before pointing a gun at his supervisors and handcuffing them. He then stole $7 million in cash before fleeing. This was the largest cash robbery in U.S. history at that time. He had planned this with 2 other men, but had turned on them and took the money for himself. On May 14th of 1984, he became a member of the FBI's top 10 most wanted fugitives. In 2010, he became the fugitive to have spent the most time on that list. To this day, there are no real leads as to where he may be, but it's thought that he's living in Cuba. The FBI is still offering $1 million reward for information leading to his arrest. In our 6th spot today, we have Arnaldo Jimenez. Arnaldo is wanted for the death of his wife, Estrella Carrara. On May 11th, 2012, the pair got married at Chicago City Hall, and they were as happy as they could ever be. That night, they had dinner with some family and friends before heading to a nightclub. However, on their way home, the couple got in a heated argument. It resulted in him fatally stabbing his new wife before dragging her body into their apartment. He then placed her in a bathtub and fled. After not picking her kids up from a family member's house, people began to worry, and she was reported missing to the police. It's thought that he fled to Mexico. A reward of up to $100,000 is available for information leading to his arrest. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark today with Hazel Leota. In August of 1999, Hazel Leota placed an ad in a Lonely Hearts column looking for love. That's when she met Charles Baker. Immediately, she was attracted to Charles because he was a widow who recently got a large sum of money from his insurance. So shortly after meeting, the two moved in together. In September of 1998, Charles was found dead in his house. His car and $45,000 of his money was missing, and so was Hazel. She had killed him and took off with his cash and car. Turns out Hazel wasn't who she said she was. No shocker. In fact, she had over 25 different aliases. She's also been married 10 times and is wanted in Lincoln, Nebraska. The last time anyone saw her was in December of 1998 when she was spotted in a truck stop near Wheat Ridge, Colorado. She hasn't been spotted since. If she's alive to this day, she would be in her 70s. In our 4th spot today, we have Alvin Scott. Alvin Scott is wanted in a double murder. In August of 2001, his wife left him and was living with a male friend in the meantime, and Alvin did not like this. On the day of their divorce proceedings, Alvin stalked the two and killed them both. Alvin has more than a decade's experience in military training and was an experienced PI, so he was able to stalk the two and shoot and kill them from his car. He then fled and has been on the run ever since. It's believed that he has multiple fake passports and multiple fake identities. And due to his experience in the military, he's been hard to track. He is one of the FBI's top 10 most wanted fugitives, and there's a $100,000 reward for any leads on his whereabouts. In our 3rd spot today, we have Joe Matthew Constance. On June 5th, 2011, Joe Matthew Constance broke into his ex-wife's house looking for her. However, she was not there. There were, however, other people there, so he threatened them with a gun, being like, "Tell me where she is or I'll kill you." They did not reveal where his wife was. So Joe searched the whole house and eventually did find her on the property. He then shot and killed her before fleeing. He was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated assault, and aggravated burglary. However, he's still never been caught. There is a $20,000 reward out there for any information leading to the arrest and conviction of Joe. Moving on to number 2, we have Jason Derek Brown. On November 29, 2004 in Phoenix, Arizona, Jason Derek Brown shot and killed an armored car guard outside of a movie theater before fleeing with the money. Since 2004, he has been wanted for murder and armed robbery. Now, Jason portrayed himself as a wealthy man, but in reality, he was tens of thousands of dollars in debt. This was his motive for the murder and robbery. If he's still alive, he would be 52. FBI has made it clear that Jason is armed and very dangerous. There is a $200,000 reward for anyone who can provide information on Brown's whereabouts. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Badrush Kumar Patel. After getting married in India, Badrush Kumar and his wife Palak left their home country to start a new life in the United States. In fact, they both got jobs at Dunkin' Donuts and they worked together. On April 12th of 2015, while working a night shift, Palak was on the phone with her family, crying, saying that she wanted to go back to India. In fact, the pair's visas had expired. A while later, he led her to a back room in the store and stabbed her multiple times. This was after the two had an argument. She wanted to go home to India and he wanted to stay in the US. After taking his wife's life, he fled the scene. Now, customers at the store grew concerned after they realized that no one was in the store to serve them. A police officer just so happened to be nearby and decided to check out the scene. That's when he found Palak. Badrush Kumar has been on the run ever since. A $100,000 reward is available to anyone who can provide information leading to his arrest.
And we're starting things off with Jeronique Cunningham and Cleveland Jackson. On January 3rd of 2002, Jeronique Cunningham and his half-brother Cleveland Jackson committed a violent crime in Lima, Ohio. They took the lives of 3-year-old Jala Grant and 17-year-old Lanisha Williams. The victims, along with 6 others, were present at the house of a man targeted by Cunningham and Jackson for a robbery involving drugs and money. Following the robbery, Cunningham and Jackson opened fire on everyone inside the house. Tragically, Jala died while her father held her in his arms. Cunningham and Jackson also attempted to take the lives of the survivors, each of whom sustained gunshot injuries during the incident. Both Cunningham and Jackson were convicted, with Jackson receiving a death sentence. Cunningham is currently serving a life sentence. Next on the list is George Wagner IV. In April of 2016 in Pike County, Ohio, a gruesome incident took place, now known as the Pike County Massacre. 8 members of the Rodin family were tragically taken from life in 4 separate homes. The victims included 7 adults and a 16-year-old, all shot to death. In November of 2018, authorities arrested George Wagner III, his wife Angela Wagner, and their 2 sons, George Wagner IV and Edward Wagner Jr. in connection with the crimes. The family was accused of meticulously planning and executing these attacks. Their motive was believed to be centered around child custody, financial disputes, and an illegal marijuana growing operation. Next up, we have Michael Madison. So Michael Madison, born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1977, was convicted in 2016 for the deaths of 3 young women in East Cleveland, Ohio. Between 2012 and 2013, he took the lives of his victims, whose remains were discovered in various locations near his residence. Madison's arrest in 2013 followed the discovery of the first victim's body wrapped in plastic in a garage. Neighbors had noticed a foul odor coming from his property, and authorities were alerted. Their investigations continued, and this led to the identification of 2 additional victims. Police found the remains of the second victim in a weeded lot, and the third victim's body was found in a nearby abandoned house in the basement. During his trial, Madison actually smirked, causing a father of one of the victims to lunge at him in anger. Luckily, that man was released without charges. Madison was found guilty of multiple charges, including aggravated murder and kidnapping. In 2016, he was sentenced to death for his crimes. Next up on the list is Donald Hoffman. Donald Hoffman was convicted of taking the lives of 4 men over the Labor Day weekend in 2015. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms. The victims, Freeland Hensley, 67, Gerald Smith, 65, Billy Jack Chapman, 55, and Daryl Lewis, 65, were residents of Bucharest, Ohio. Hoffman admitted to his crimes, stating he committed the acts to fund his drug addiction. And during the slayings, Hoffman used various methods of violence. He beat Hensley with a frying pan, strangled Smith with an electrical cord, struck Smith in the head with a bottle, strangled Lewis with shoelaces, and attacked Chapman with a pry bar. Hoffman stole the victim's debit and credit cards, spending over $2,100 on drugs and cigarettes. Prosecutor revealed that Hoffman specifically targeted older men with health issues whom he knew personally. Number 6, the Downtown Posse. During the Christmas season of 1992, the Downtown Posse, led by Marvelous Keene, embarked on a brutal crime spree in Dayton, Ohio. Their first victim was Joseph Wilkerson, a 34-year-old General Motors worker. The gang lured their way into his home where Wilkinson was shot. The gang then partied in his house for the next 3 days while he lay dead in a bedroom. On the same night, they took the life of 18-year-old Danita Golette, who was using a payphone. She was robbed of her belongings and lost her life despite pleading not to be harmed and cooperating as best as she could with them. The following day, the body of 19-year-old Richard Maddox, a former boyfriend of one of the gang members, was discovered. Jeffrey Wright was also shot but survived his attack, having received multiple wounds. Continuing their violent spree, the gang shot Sarah Abraham, 8-year-old mother working in a family business. Abraham succumbed to her injuries 5 days later. On December 26th, former Dayton Police Sergeant John Huber spotted a stolen car connected to the group. He arrested them, not yet aware of their involvement in everything else that had been going on. After their arrest, Laura Taylor, one of the members of the Downtown Posse, confessed to 2 more victims, the bodies of Wendy Cottrill and Marvin Washington, who were found in a gravel pit. Taylor revealed they took them out because the gang believed they might inform the police about their crimes. Marvelous Keene, the gang's leader, confessed and was sentenced to death, with his sentence being carried out back in 2009. The other 3 members received life prison sentences. Next on the list is Edward Edwards, which is just the dumbest name I've ever heard. Just laziness on his parents' behalf, but that's all this guy really deserved. Born in 1933, Edwards' criminal activities started at a young age with burglaries and frauds. He was arrested multiple times over the years for various offenses, including arson, robbery. In 1961, he was convicted of arson and spent several years in prison. After being released, though, Edwards took the lives of several people, including his own adopted son. He took the lives of 2 different couples in the 70s, and in 1992, he ended the life of his adoptive son, Donnie Boy Edwards, committing the crime for financial gain in order to collect his $250,000 life insurance policy. Edwards' crimes went undetected for many years, allowing him to continue his criminal activities, but in 2009, he was finally apprehended and charged with crimes he committed decades earlier. He was linked to the crimes through advancements in forensic technology and DNA evidence. Ariel Castro. Castro was born in Puerto Rico, but he moved to Cleveland, Ohio with his mother when he was young, and this is where he would grow up to commit his crimes. Castro was responsible for the abduction and imprisonment of 3 women, Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina De Jesus. These 3 women were held captive in Castro's home for about 10 years. That is crazy. One of the victims, Amanda Berry, even gave birth to her daughter during this time. They were subjected to physical and emotional torment, which included being kept in restraints, confined to a few rooms in the house. Amanda Berry managed to escape from Castro's home in May of 2013, though. Castro had left the home for the day, and she managed to catch a glimpse of his neighbors through a screen door. She screamed for help and managed to make contact with them. All 3 women were luckily rescued, as well as Berry's daughter. Castro was arrested shortly after the escape. In 2013, he was charged with multiple counts. To avoid the possibility of facing the death penalty, he later pleaded guilty to the charges, and in August 2013, Castro was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and, just because why not, he got an additional 1,000 years in prison. So yeah, safe to say he's not getting released anytime soon. Next up, we have TJ Lane. So many have heard of this case. This guy became pretty infamous for his conduct in the courtroom, where he showed absolutely zero remorse or regret for his actions, taunting the victims' families, giving the middle finger to everyone in the courtroom, and pretty astonishing, really. TJ Lane was convicted for a school shooting at Chardon High School in Ohio on February 27th of 2012. He opened fire in the school cafeteria, resulting in the deaths of 3 students and injuries to 3 others, one of which became permanently paralyzed. Lane was arrested the same day and later found guilty of multiple charges. In 2013, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Lane actually did manage to escape from prison in 2014 along with 2 other inmates. They'd used a makeshift ladder to scale a fence during recreational hours. Luckily, though, he was found later that night. He's now serving in a maximum security prison, the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. Next up, we have Robert Berdella. Now, this guy died in 1992, so a return is highly unlikely, but he's got to be one of the worst criminals in Ohio's history, right up there with Dahmer, possibly even worse. He was born in Ohio in 1949, but his crimes were carried out in Kansas City between 1984 and 87. He was responsible for the deaths of at least 6 men. Berdella lured his victims, often vulnerable young men, to his home with promise of money or shelter, and once in his captivity, he subjected them to prolonged periods of sadistic torment. He would hold them in captivity, sometimes for as long as 6 weeks at a time before disposing of them. His crime spree came to an end in 1988, though, when one of his victims managed to escape and alert the police. The bodies of his former victims were never found, unfortunately, but police did find journals and Berdella had written chronicling his crimes, as well as photographs and personal belongings of the victims. Berdella was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He died in prison in 1992 due to a heart attack. Finally, we have Sean Great, eventually being sentenced to death for his crimes, having taken the life of 5 young women. His last victim, whose real name has been kept secret, known to the public simply as Jane Doe, had met Great at the Ashland Salvation Army Ray and Joan Croc Core Community Center. She viewed their relationship as purely platonic and would consistently reject his advances, but Great managed to lure her to his home using the ruse of offering her some clothes he claimed to have for her. Once inside though, his personality completely flipped and he attacked her. She ended up being held captive for 3 whole days. But there's a light at the end of this tunnel. She managed to find an opportunity to secretly contact the police while Great was asleep. This led to his arrest and the end of her nightmare. And during the legal proceedings that followed, Great was found guilty of his crimes. He's currently sitting on death row. And at number 9, we have Sean Sellers. He was a self-proclaimed Satanist who claimed to be possessed by a demon named Azaret. In 1985, at the age of 16, Sellers took the lives of his parents, Vonda and Paul, in their Oklahoma home. He later confessed to these acts, as well as having shot a convenience store clerk a year prior who refused to sell him beer. Sellers stated that his involvement in Satanism influenced his actions. According to Sellers, he believed he was possessed by the demon, which drove him to commit the violent acts. And Sellers was eventually arrested, tried, and convicted for the crimes. He was sentenced to death in 1986, and during his time on death row, he became a born-again Christian and renounced his previous involvement in Satanism, but despite his change in beliefs and multiple appeals, Sellers was executed by lethal injection in 1999. Next up is Manuela and Daniel Ruda, 2 lovers bound together by their passion for violence in the name of the Dark Lord. How romantic. Manuela and Daniel Ruda were a German couple involved in a highly disturbing incident in 2001. They were responsible for the death of Frank Hackert, and their reason for taking their friend's life? Well, according to the couple at the time, they thought he was so funny and would be the perfect court jester for Satan. The Rudas were deeply immersed in occult practices, spending time vacationing in England and Scotland, sleeping in graveyards, and going to devil-worshipping parties. The couple subjected Hackert to hours of violent rituals, which tragically led to his demise. After taking Hackert's life, they stuck his body in a coffin that they used as a coffee table. They attempted to dismember his body, but they were apprehended before they could dispose of the remains. They were actually caught in a gas station, and apparently they were brandishing chainsaws, like waiting for the authorities to arrive. Very insane. In 2002, they were both convicted of the crime, with Daniel receiving a prison sentence and Manuela being committed to a psychiatric institution because of her diminished mental state. She cut her ties with Daniel when he was in prison, though, and he landed himself in court once again years later when he apparently attempted to hire a hitman to take her out. True love at its finest. As insane as all this is, using a coffin for a coffee table, that is actually an awesome idea. I am taking note of that. Nikolai Ogolbiak. This next case happened in 2008 in Russia. It's pretty disturbing. Nikolai was a former choir boy turned Satanist and led a small cult of Satan worshippers. He and a few of his underlings lured 4 teenagers in the local goth scene into the woods about 300 miles northeast of Moscow, where they forced them to drink alcohol before stabbing them 666 times each. After that, they ate parts of their victims' bodies. The group was arrested when various body parts were found in Nikolai's apartment complex. One member was quoted saying, "Satan will help me avoid responsibility. I made many sacrifices to him." Another said, "I tried to turn to God, but it didn't bring me any money. I prayed to Satan and things improved." It didn't improve that much because now you're in prison, but yeah. Number 6, the Beasts of Satan. The members of the Beasts of Satan were primarily young individuals in the metal scene in Soma, Lombardo, Italy. They shared an interest in Satanism and the occult, and they believed in ritualistic practices influenced by the darker aspects of satanic worship. One night in January of 1998, after hanging out at Midnight Pub listening to heavy metal music, 3 members, Andrea Volpe, Nicola Sapone, and Mario Muccione, lured 2 of their friends out into the woods and took their lives in a ritualistic sacrifice. They buried their bodies in the woods and then danced on their graves, chanting, "Now you're both zombies. Try to get out of this hole if you dare." Might have sounded catchier in Italian. The group got away with this initially. Authorities didn't look into the 2 teens' disappearances because they were a couple, and police were like, "Oh yeah, they probably ran off together." Great policing work. Then in 2004, the group's leader, Andre Volpe, took the life of his ex-girlfriend, believing she knew too much about the incident from 7 years prior. Then he and his buddy buried the body before taking a large amount of drugs, crashing their car into a tree. The two were arrested, and during interrogations, everything came out. Next on the list is Ricky Queso. In 1984, Ricky Queso, a teenager from Northport, New York, took the life of his friend Gary Lowers. On June 16, 1984, Queso and a group of friends, who were all part of a group they called the Knights of the Black Circle, lured Lowers to a remote wooded area. There, a confrontation ensued, during which Queso and his accomplices subjected Lowers to a drawn-out beating. Queso apparently tried to force Lowers into praising Satan. Lowers refused, though, repeating that he loved his mother. The entire group was high on psychedelic drugs at the time. Queso would then brag about the incident to his friends days afterwards, claiming that Satan had appeared to him in the form of a black crow. When it cawed, he interpreted it as Satan giving his approval of the attack. This was at the height of the satanic panic in the US, and Queso's fascination with satanic rituals and the occult, and the fact that he was wearing an AC/DC t-shirt when he was arrested, it all became the focal point in the media coverage of the case. And shortly after the incident, Queso was arrested and charged in connection with Lowers' demise. And before he could stand trial, though, he took his own life in his jail cell on July 7th of 84. Number 4, the Ripper Crew. The Ripper Crew was a notorious satanic cult active in Chicago during the 80s, comprising of 4 members: Robert Gett, Edward Spreitzer, and brothers Andrew and Thomas Cocorellis. They carried out a series of heinous crimes, abducting and taking the lives of several women in the area. They followed this twisted version of Satanism, using it as a justification for their violent acts. Their leader, Robin Gett, allegedly believed that offering human sacrifices to Satan, he would then gain supernatural powers and protection. The Ripper Crew targeted young women. They abducted their victims, subjected them to brutal torment, and then took their lives as part of their ritualistic practices. In 82, the police arrested Robin Gett. During his interrogation, he confessed to several crimes and provided information about the cult's activities, and this led to the arrest and conviction of the other members, including Edward Spreitzer and the Cocorellis brothers. But it's essential to I want to say, their actions aren't really representative of mainstream Satanism. I think that this goes for everyone on this list. In real life, Satanism really is not about promoting violence. Anyway, in 83, Robin Gett was sentenced to 120 years in prison. Edward Spreitzer and Andrew Cocorellis were sentenced to death, with Spreitzer later receiving a life sentence after Illinois temporarily banned the death penalty, and Thomas Cocorellis was actually released from prison in 2019 for some reason. Next on the list, we have Krista Pike. In January 1995, Krista Gale Pike, who was 18 at the time, along with 2 accomplices, Shadola Peterson and Tadariel Shipp, Pike's boyfriend, were involved in a gruesome incident that claimed the life of classmate Colleen Slemmer. Pike had a disturbing interest in Satanism and the occult, and carried out the act in a particularly disturbing manner. So it all started when Slemmer seemed to be talking to her boyfriend a little too much for Krista's liking, so she formed a plan with Shipp and Peterson to take Slemmer out of the picture. The trio lured Slemmer to a vacant steam plant where they violently attacked her. They beat her for 30 minutes, cut her up, even carved a pentagram into her chest. In 1996, Krista Pike was convicted of her role in the event, and despite her young age, was sentenced to death. She's currently still on death row. Number 2, Richard Ramirez, or as he became known, the Night Stalker, one of the most notorious criminals in American history. Ramirez was heavily influenced by Satanism, and he often left satanic symbols at the scenes of his crimes. He was known to draw pentagrams on the walls and leave occult objects behind. Ramirez believed that he was protected by dark forces and that Satan guided his actions. During 84 and 85, Ramirez took the lives of at least 13 people in Southern California. His victims, ranging in age from 9 to 83, were subjected to brutal attacks, and in some cases, he would also burglarize the people's homes. He would also force many of his victims to profess their love for Satan. Unlike a lot of criminals of his kind who typically have a specific pattern to the types of people they'll victimize, Ramirez was more unpredictable. His victims were almost entirely random. Men, women, young, old, didn't matter to him. Now, the way this all ends is probably the most cathartic I've heard in any notorious criminal case like this. In 1985, Ramirez was chased down by residents in East Los Angeles after they recognized him from news coverage. An angry mob formed and Ramirez was just romped on until police showed up. It's like the ending of Frankenstein or something, only Ramirez actually deserved what he got. He was unarrested, tried, and convicted. He died in 2013 while on death row in San Quentin.
Coming in at number 10 is Gavin Smith. In December 2020, teen Gavin Smith ended the lives of his mother, stepfather, and 2 younger brothers. He was dating Rebecca Walker, and their parents didn't approve of their relationship. Now, the day of the crime, Rebecca was on a video chat call with Gavin, who was at his house. She said that he showed her a firearm and a knife over the video chat, and she knew what he had planned. When Rebecca was asked if she encouraged Gavin to commit the crime, she said, "I was on the video chat with him. I didn't tell him, but I was texting him on the video chat. I told him to hurry up and do it." Now, Gavin was found guilty of first-degree homicide on 3 counts and guilty of the lesser offense, second-degree homicide on 1. He was sentenced to 3 life sentences for the first-degree homicide convictions, 40 years in prison for a second-degree homicide, and 10 years for the use or possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. Now, due to him being a teen at the time of the crime, he will automatically be eligible to see a parole board in 15 years. Number 9. Mary Beth Davis. Mary Beth Davis is a former nurse who was convicted of the deaths of her daughter and son in 1997. In September 1981, in Lewisburg, West Virginia, her son Seth had suffered massive damage to his brain, which prosecutors believed was caused by an injection of a large amount of insulin. He was later moved to a mental institution where he spent the rest of his life. Now, several months after the incident with Seth, on March 11, 1982, her daughter Tegan died of a caffeine pill overdose. Dr. Ann Hooper, who performed the autopsy on the girl, found hundreds of capsules inside the digestive tract. In 1997, Mary Beth was put on trial for the death of Tegan and injury to Seth. It was reported that prosecutors believed that she suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Mary Beth received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, and Seth Davis then died on October 10, 2002 at the age of 21, and his death was recorded as a homicide. Now, after signing a plea deal and giving a one-word confession in 2007, Mary Beth was released from prison. Number 8. Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. Skylar Neese was a teenager who disappeared from her home in Star City, West Virginia around midnight on July 6, 2012. She was initially considered by law enforcement authorities to be a runaway, and an Amber Alert was not immediately issued in connection with her disappearance. Now, the break in the case came when Rachel, Skylar's best friend, admitted to plotting with Sheila to end Skylar's life. Now, the motivation Rachel gave for the death was they didn't like her and they didn't want to be friends with her anymore. David Neese stated that these 2 girls were among his daughter's best friends and that Sheila had even helped the family by distributing missing person flyers. Now, after her confession, Rachel led investigators to Skylar's body. Skylar's body was found less than 30 miles away from her home. Rachel pleaded guilty to second-degree homicide on May 1, 2013, and was sentenced to 30 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 10 years. Sheila pleaded guilty to first-degree homicide on January 24, 2014, and was sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole after 15 years. Number 7. Jody Hunt. On December 1, 2014, Jody Hunt snapped and ended the lives of 4 people in West Virginia. He wrote a lengthy Facebook post about how brokenhearted he was just hours before the shootings. He said, "I am deeply hurt by the events that lead up to this day. I did not choose to have the love of my life go behind my back and sleep with several guys." He adds, "You will not hurt me anymore," and his rant goes on as he thanks Lisa's family. In conclusion, he begs for someone to take good care of his dogs. Jody, the owner of a towing company, ended the lives of his partner, his business rival, his ex-girlfriend, and the woman's new boyfriend. Jody was then found dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in his car along US Route 19. Now, despite his death, West Virginia State Police Lieutenant Michael Bayless told the Associated Press that detectives had to sit down and piece all those puzzle pieces together and find out how all of this happened. Number 6. James Childers. On June 1, 2009, a packet containing letters and an audio tape confession from James Childers was delivered to the Clarksburg police station, most of which consisted of incoherent ramblings, but also had him admitting to committing 5 deaths and 4 arsons that had occurred in the last few years. He did not express remorse for what he had done and said that his misanthropic views were the motive, admitting an extensive resentment, paranoia, distrust, and anger directed towards everybody around him, including relatives. In the tape, James claimed that he had buried 4 of the victims on the family farm in Braxton County and another discarded in Barber County. A few hours after listening to the tapes, officers were dispatched to the locations, and to their horror, they found 2 skeletal female corpses. Shortly
Shortly after these discoveries, police issued an arrest warrant for James, who was last seen at the Townhouse Motel in Clarksburg. The following day, numerous officers had surrounded the motel, but upon learning this, James shot himself in the head. After confirming his death, investigators, together with dog handlers, combed through the farm, where, according to James's testimony, there were at least 3 other people buried, but no further remains were found. Number 5. Bobby Joe Long. Bobby Joe Long would use newspaper ads to find vulnerable women, and if the women were alone when he arrived at their home, he would take advantage and rob them. He took advantage and ended the lives of at least 10 women, though prosecutors believed him to be connected to as many as 50 other crimes across the Tampa, Florida area. The first of his slayings happened in March 1984. The first body discovered by the police were the remains of Nguyen Thai Long, who had recently quit her job as an exotic dancer and planned to go back to school. Bobby lured her into his car by offering her a ride. He drove her to a back road where he took advantage of her and then strangled her to death. Now, one of his other victims, Lisa McVeigh, escaped, and it wasn't until she saw a forensic drawing of him on TV that she recognized him as her kidnapper. She relayed this information to the officer handling her case, and Bobby was arrested 12 days later. After a lengthy trial and multiple appeal attempts, Bobby was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison on May 23, 2019, and he had no final words. Number 4. Retta Mays. In June 2015, Retta Mays began working as a nursing assistant at the Lewis A. Johnson Veterans Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia, with no certification or license to care for patients. She started to work overnight shifts on Ward 3A of the hospital's medical surgical unit, and elderly patients began suffering mysterious acute drops in their blood sugar level, which resulted in many deaths. Now, the hospital began an internal investigation of 11 deaths, and she was fired from the hospital in June 2018, and the investigation was turned over to the Inspector General for the United States Department of Veterans Affairs and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now, the investigation into the deaths lasted over 2 years, and Retta remained free. She was questioned 3 times during the course of the investigation, and each time she denied any involvement in the deaths. Then in July 2020, she was then arrested and charged with the deaths of 8 individuals. The charges were later reduced to 7 second-degree homicides and 1 count of intent to commit homicide. On May 11, 2021, she was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences plus 20 years. Now, in addition to her sentence, she was ordered to pay $172,624.96 to the victims' families, the VA hospital, Medicare, and insurance companies. Number 3. Krista Pike. Krista Pike is the youngest female ever to be sentenced to death in the US when she was just 18 years old. Krista became jealous of her classmate, university student Colleen Slemmer, who she thought was trying to steal her boyfriend from her. Upon a meetup at a secluded location, Colleen was attacked by Krista while her friend acted as lookout. According to later court testimony, for the next 30 minutes, Colleen was taunted, beaten, and slashed, and a pentagram was carved into her chest. Krista then hit Colleen's skull with a large chunk of asphalt, ending her life. Now, Krista kept a piece of her skull and began to show off the piece of the skull around the school, and within 36 hours, the group was arrested. Now, soon after her arrest, Krista confessed to police, but insisted that they were merely trying to scare her, and it got out of control. Krista was charged with first-degree homicide and conspiracy to commit homicide. On March 22, 1996, after only a few hours of deliberation, she was found guilty on both counts. On March 30th, she was sentenced to death by electrocution for the death charge and 25 years in prison for the conspiracy charge. She is currently still waiting on death row. Number 2. Brandon Basham and Chadwick Fulks. Samantha Burns was last seen by her aunt at the Huntington Mall at 6:30 p.m. on the evening of November 11th, 2002. At 9:45 p.m. that evening, Samantha used her cell phone to call her mother and said that she'd been visiting friends at Marshall University Courtyard Apartments but was coming home. Unfortunately, she never arrived home and has never been heard from since. In July 2005, Chadwick Fulks and Brendan Basham pled guilty to a federal charge of carjacking, resulting in death to avoid a possible death sentence. The pair had escaped from Hopkins County Jail in November 2002, and they have said that they carjacked Samantha shortly thereafter and ended her life, though her body has never been found. They are currently on death row for another homicide, that of Alice Donovan from South Carolina. And coming in at number 1 is Eugene Blake. On January 16, 1967, Eugene Blake attacked Donna Jean Ball, and she was able to live long enough to say what she experienced before she passed. Eugene was then arrested, eventually convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Now, during his time in prison, he was described as a model inmate, so in 1976, Governor of West Virginia, Arch A. Moore Jr., commuted his sentence to life with with parole for his good conduct while being incarcerated, and in February 1979, Eugene was paroled. Then in March 1982, he came across the car of Mark Withers and a girl whose name has not been disclosed. He went up to them and knocked on the window and started screaming. When Mark rolled down the window, Blake ended up shooting him and later threw his body over a fence, then took advantage of the girl and left. Then on October 26, 1984, the body of Marion Hope Hembright was found in West Virginia. She had evidently been taken advantage of and strangled to death. In June 1985, Blake was indicted for the death and 2 counts of taking advantage of her. In 1997, he pleaded guilty on all charges and was sentenced to a 15 years to life term. Then in 2008, Blake was charged with Mark's death after his DNA was linked to the crime scene. He was soon extradited to Ohio, where prosecutors sought the death penalty against him for 3 counts of aggravated homicide. Now, in order to avoid a potential death sentence, he pleaded guilty to all charges in 2010 and was thus given a 20-year sentence with parole eligibility, stirring controversy among locals who wish that he remained incarcerated for the rest of his natural life. Coming in at number 10 is Kim Jong-un. Little is known about North Korea due to their dictator Kim Jong-un's rule, but what we do know is absolutely terrifying. Kim is very strict with his people as they can't access the internet, and if they do, it can only be government-approved sites. Same goes with film. The citizens are also treated horribly there. There's hardly any food and everyone is weak and hungry, and it's even been said that the streets are lined with dead bodies. They also have very strict laws that result in people being executed or sent to prison camps, which are one of the worst forms of torment. A former guard likened the prisoners to walking skeletons, dwarfs, and cripples in rags, and he estimated that about 30% of the prisoners had deformities such as torn off ears, smashed eyes, crooked noses, and faces covered with cuts and scars resulting from beatings and other mistreatment, and that those people were still forced to work. They had to do hard physical labor in agriculture, mining, and inside factories from 5 a.m. to 8 p.m., followed by ideological re-education and self-criticism sessions. Now, prisoners there are forced to sleep in a room with 80 to 90 people in 30 square meter flea-infested rooms and are only occasionally allowed to use the toilet, which there is one for about every 300 people, and may only take a shower after several months. No one should have to live like that, it's horrible, and this is just the stuff we do know. Kim is so secretive, I fear we don't know the true horrors of what goes on in North Korea. Number 9. Pedro Lopez. Known as the Monster of the Andes, Pedro Lopez is currently the second most prolific serial slayer in recorded history. Between 1969 and 1980, he claimed the lives of at least 110 girls throughout northern South America. However, he personally claims to have ended the lives of over 300 at a rate of 3 victims per week. He was finally arrested in 1980 and remained imprisoned until 1994. Then soon after his confession, he directed the authorities to the bodies of 53 victims, and his confession soon led to the confirmation of a total of 110 bodies in Ecuador. Later in 1980, Pedro was convicted of homicide and sentenced to 16 years in prison, the maximum prison sentence available in Ecuador at the time. However, Pedro was quickly re-arrested and sent to a mental institution in his native Colombia. He remained there for 4 years and was released in 1998 as he was declared sane and released on a $70 bail on the condition that he would periodically report to the authorities, but he almost immediately ran away. The last reported sighting of Pedro was in September 1999 when he visited the National Civil Registry to renew his citizenship card. In 2002, Colombian National Police and Interpol issued warrants for his arrest over a death bearing similarities to his MO. The Interpol warrant was deactivated in 2005, but he still remains a fugitive. Neither his location nor his status are known of today. Number 8. Vlad the Impaler. Born in 1431, Vlad Tepes the Impaler earned his nickname from his favorite method of execution for enemies of the state and witches. He was the ruler of Wallachia, and according to legend, he would impale his victims on a sharp stake or nail them headfirst onto a large wooden pole and then watch as they died slowly from blood loss. His other favorite methods were boiling them alive in oil or water or both, burning them alive with sulfur, and roasting them over an open fire. He also enjoyed hanging criminals upside down from poles and then cutting off their heads with a saber while they were still alive, just so they could see what was happening before they died. Yeah, I wouldn't want to get on his bad side. Number 7. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was the founder and first Khagan of the Mongol Empire, which later became the largest adjoining land empire in history. Having spent the majority of his life uniting Mongol tribes, he launched a series of military campaigns which conquered large parts of China and Central Asia. In the 13th century, he ended the lives of so many peasants that the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were significantly reduced as a result. During his 21-year reign, his destructive armies were responsible for the deaths up to 40 million people. Now, with so many people gone and nobody left to farm the lands owned by peasants, nature went back to its true form and grew back into carbon-absorbing forests. Now, it's estimated that 700 million tons of carbon were wiped from the atmosphere, which, to put in perspective, is around the same amount of carbon dioxide generated in a year through global gasoline consumption. While that was good for the environment, it wasn't good for the people who lost their lives. He then died in August of 1227, but his death was kept a closely guarded secret. According to legend, Genghis Khan's last words were to a few faithful followers, which were, "I have conquered for you a large empire, but my life was too short to take the whole world. That I leave you." Now that is also absolutely terrifying to hear. Number 6. Ivan the Terrible. I mean, with a name like that, you gotta know he's a bad guy. Renowned for his temper and paranoia, Russian ruler Ivan IV Vasilievich inspired incredible fear. As a teenager, he liked mistreating animals, throwing cats and dogs from the Kremlin ramparts. He served as the first Tsar of Russia, reigning from 1533 to 1584. He established a personal guard who helped him terrorize and oppress his subjects through torment and execution. After defections and the death of his wife in the 1560s, he became even more violent, ordering the massacre of Novgorod in 1570 with casualties in the thousands. He also beat his own pregnant daughter-in-law, after which she miscarried. When his son asked him about this, he was filled with rage at this apparent uproar of disloyalty from his son and struck him with a staff he often carried to punish servants. The strike cracked his son's skull, and the blow ultimately ended his life, leaving Ivan's other son as the new heir. Number 5. Shiro Ishii. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that undertook lethal human experimentation during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. It was responsible for some of the most notorious war crimes carried out by Japanese personnel. Some of the numerous atrocities committed by the commander Shiro Ishii and others under his command in Unit 731 include vivisection of living people, including pregnant women who were impregnated by the doctors. Prisoners had limbs amputated and reattached to other parts of their body. Some prisoners had part of their bodies frozen and thawed to study the resulting untreated gangrene. Humans were also used as living test cases for grenades and flamethrowers, and prisoners were injected with strains of diseases disguised as vaccinations to study their effects. Now, having been granted immunity by the American occupation authorities at the end of the war, Ishii never spent any time in jail for his crimes and died at the age of 67 of throat cancer. The death toll of these brutal experiments is unknown, but many as 200,000 people may have died, estimates historian Sheldon H. Harris, according to a 1995 New York Times report. Number 4. Robert Thompson and John Venables. On February 12, 1993, elementary school boys Robert Thompson and John Venables lured James Patrick Bulger away from the New Strand Shopping Center in Bootle after his mother had taken her eyes off him momentarily. The two boys had approached James, took him by the hand, and led him out of the shopping center. They then took James to the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, around a quarter mile from the shopping center, where they dropped him on his head and he suffered injuries to his face. One of the boys threw blue paint that they had shoplifted earlier into James's left eye. They kicked him, stomped on him, and threw bricks and stones at him. They placed batteries in James's mouth, and finally the boys dropped a 22-pound railway fish plate on him. His mutilated body was found on the railway line 2 days after his abduction. He sustained 10 skull fractures as a result of the bar striking his head, and pathologist Alan Williams stated that he suffered so many injuries, 42 in total, that none could be identified as the fatal blow. Now, Robert and John were charged on February 20th, 1993 with abduction and homicide, and they were found guilty on November 24th, making them the youngest convicted slayers in modern British history. They were sentenced to an indefinite detention center at Her Majesty's pleasure and remained in custody until a parole board decision in June 2001 recommended their release on a lifelong license at 18. Number 3. Jim Jones. In the 1950s, Indiana native Jim Jones founded a church called the People's Temple that he claimed to promote socialism and equality with religious elements of Christianity. Initially, he was a little more than a charismatic hustler, but as the years progressed, he demanded more and more of his followers. In the early 1970s, Jones moved his group to California and set them in a commune-like settlement in Redwood Valley. Jones eventually came to believe that a nuclear war was imminent and moved his followers again to the South American country of Guyana, which he thought would be outside the potential danger zone. The group lived there for several years as the People's Temple Agricultural Project, but after former members started speaking out against the church, San Francisco Congressman Leo Ryan decided to travel to Jonestown to investigate claims of mistreatment. Temple security guards opened fire on Leo's group, and back at the settlement, Jones ordered his followers to drink a cyanide-laced beverage, and this is where the phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid" originates. A total of 918 people died in the incident, and until 2001, it was the largest loss of American civilian life in history. Number 2. Nero. Nero was a deranged Roman emperor and the final emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, reigning from AD 54 until his death in AD 68. It's hard to be worse than having your own mother executed and poisoning your stepbrother, right? Well, what about burning prisoners in your garden at night as a source of light? Yeah, well, that's him. Now, Nero married Poppaea Sabina, but she mysteriously perished before having their second child. Now, historians of the time claim that Nero actually kicked Poppaea to death, and after her death, Nero fell in love with a man named Sporus, whose most striking feature was the resemblance to Nero's late wife. Nero then had the boy castrated and brought back to his palace, where he took calling him Lady and Queen. Now, ultimately, Nero's lifestyle caught up to him, and in 68 AD, after a turbulent 13-year reign, the Roman Senate ran out of patience and declared Nero a public enemy. Nero then fled, and on June 9, 68 AD, at the age of 30, he ended his own life. And coming in at number 1 is Ed Gein. Ed Gein was a serial slayer and grave robber. He created costumes, furniture, and other keepsakes from the bodies of his victims. While he was only officially convicted of taking the lives of 2 people, Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, a police raid on his house turned up masks literally made from humans' faces, a belt of nipples, and a corset created from a skinned torso. Now, to be clear, he never wore these costumes when ending people's lives. Instead, he donned them in the privacy of his own home. Now, some masks appeared mummified, almost dried out, while others were more carefully preserved. A few had lipstick applied and looked more lifelike, and 4 had been stuffed with paper and hung on the wall of his bedroom, almost like hunting trophies. Ed was initially found unfit to stand trial and confined to a mental health facility, but by 1968 he was judged competent to stand trial. He was found guilty of the deaths, but he was found legally insane and was remanded to a psychiatric institution. Coming in at number 10 is Nikolai Yezhov. Nikolai Yezhov was a Soviet secret police officer including at the height of the Great Purge. He organized mass arrests, tormented, and executions, but then he fell from Stalin's good graces. He was arrested and subsequently admitting in a confession to a range of anti-Soviet activity, including unfounded arrests during the Purge. He was executed in 1940 along with others who were blamed for the Purge. Now, Nikolai wasn't only ousted, executed, and disgraced along with his family, he was then methodically erased from photographs where he had previously appeared with his commander. Overnight, Nikolai went from one of the highest officers in a powerful New World Order to a shadow in a poorly lit photo and a name no one dared to utter. Now, Nikolai wasn't the only person to receive this Photoshop treatment, as it was common in the communist government to deny failures and make inconvenient truths, even people, disappear. Now, the practice has continued in current communist-led governments where rebellious leaders are removed by force and deleted from official documents. Coming in at number 9 is Delphine LaLaurie. Delphine LaLaurie was a sadistic serial slayer socialite who lived in New Orleans. On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out in her mansion's kitchen, and firefighters found a 70-year-old black woman chained to the stove. Now, she appeared to have started the fire in order to attract outside attention while Delphine was trying to save her furniture. Now, the authorities were led by other slaves to the attic, and they were shocked. Disfigured and maimed slaves were chained to the walls or floors. Several had been subjects to medical experiments, most likely performed by her husband, who was a doctor. One man appeared to be part of some bizarre change, a woman was trapped in a small cage with her limbs broken and reset to look like a crab, and another woman with arms and legs removed and patches of her flesh sliced off in a circular motion to resemble a caterpillar. There were claims that an elderly man had his face so beaten it was indistinguishable, and one woman had her back wounded to the point where her bones were visible. Some had their mouths sewn shut and starved to death, others had their hands sewn to different body parts, and most were found dead, and the remaining that were alive were begging to die to be released from the unbearable pain. Now LaLaurie and her husband fled by boat before she could be brought to justice, leaving the butler, who also participated, to face the wrath of a mob that had gathered outside. Number 8. Zhang Qing. Zhang Qing was a Chinese communist revolutionary, actress, and major political figure during the Cultural Revolution. She was the fourth wife of Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Communist Party and paramount leader of China. Now Zhang was best known for playing a major role in the Cultural Revolution and forming the radical political alliance known as the Gang of Four. Through clever maneuvering, she managed to reach the highest position of power within the Communist Party, just short of being president. It is believed that she was the main driving force behind China's Cultural Revolution, of which she was the deputy director. Now during the Cultural Revolution, much economic activity was halted, and countless ancient buildings, artifacts, antiques, books, and paintings were destroyed by Red Guards. Millions of people in China reportedly had their human rights annulled during this time, and millions more were also forcibly displaced. Estimates of the death toll of civilians and Red Guards from various Western and Eastern sources are about 500,000 in the true years of chaos of 1966 to 1969, but some estimate as high as 3 million deaths, with 36 million being prosecuted. Number 7. Jang Song-taek. Jang Song-taek was the uncle of the current dictator of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. He was more focused on following in the ways of his brother, Kim Jong-il, something that the new dictator didn't agree with. Now at the beginning of his rule, Kim Jong-un was still considered quite young for his political position, and some of his choices were questionable at best. Seeing that his uncle didn't agree with him, he had him tried by a special military tribunal and executed by a firing squad. Now after his execution, Kim ordered all media outlets within North Korea to remove any sort of record of him, and that included any sort of pictures or information from history books. Number 6. Peter Burnett. Peter Burnett was an American politician who served as the first elected governor of California from December 20th, 1849 to January 9th, 1851. Now in 1848, he moved to California during the height of the California Gold Rush. He was appointed to serve on the Supreme Court of California, and even though he had enslaved 2 people, to make California a slave state, instead pushing for a total exclusion of African Americans in California. Governor Peter signed into the law the so-called Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which enabled the enslavement of native Californians and contributed to their genocide. He declared in an 1851 speech that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate the results, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power and wisdom of man to avert. Now efforts by federal negotiators to preserve some native land rights were fought by the administration of Peter, who favored the elimination of California's indigenous peoples. Now he also passed the Foreign Miners Act, which taxed only Chinese and Mexicans, deliberately designed to drive them out of the gold fields. Now a wave of violence against them took place before and after. Number 5. H.H. Holmes. H.H. Holmes was a con artist who liked to take the lives of people. Until his execution in 1896, he chose a career of crime, including insurance fraud, 3 to 4 illegal marriages, horse theft, and ending the lives of many. He claimed to have ended the lives of 27 people before he was arrested, tried, and executed. He constructed a hotel of horrors, later known as the Murder Castle, to target guests visiting the Windy City during the 1893 World Fair. Now the building was equipped with soundproof rooms and had gas lines that could be used to asphyxiate guests. It also had trap doors and a secret series of tunnels that Holmes could use to spirit away their bodies, which he was believed to have dissected and sold. Now in the basement were a dissecting table, stretching rack, and industrial oven. On May 7th, 1896, Holmes was executed, and in 2017, amid allegations that Holmes had in fact escaped execution, his body was exhumed for testing. Due to his coffin being contained in cement, his body was found not to have decomposed normally. His clothes were almost perfectly preserved, and his mustache was found to be intact. intact. Now his body was positively identified by his teeth as being that of Holmes, and he was then reburied. Number 4. Ante Pavelic. Ante Pavelic was a Croatian politician who founded and headed the fascist ultranationalist organization known as the Ustashi in 1929 and served as a dictator of the independent state of Croatia, also known as the NDH. Ante and the Ustashi prosecuted many racial minorities and political opponents in the NDH during the war, including Serbians, Jewish and Roma people, and anti-fascists, becoming one of the key figures side of Serbians. At the behest of the German senior Ustaše Slavo Kosmic declared the NDH's establishment on April 10, 1941 in the name of Ante. Ante then returned from Italy and took control of the puppet government. He created a political system similar to that of fascist Italy and Germany. After taking control, Ante imposed largely anti-Serbian and anti-Semitic policies that resulted in the deaths of over 100,000 Serbians and Jewish people in concentration and extermination camps in the NDH, which resulted in the torment and deaths of several 100,000 Serbians, along with tens of thousands of Roma and Jewish people. Now, following the surrender of Germany in May 1945, he fled, and ironically, on April 10, 1957, a Serbian hotel owner attempted to end his life by shooting him. Now, initially surviving, the resulting injuries would lead to his death on December 28, 1959. Number 3. General Yahya Khan. General Yahya Khan was a Pakistani military officer who served as the 3rd president of Pakistan from 1969 to 1971. Now, he also served as the commander-in-chief of the Pakistan Army from 1966 to 1971. Now, along with Tika Khan, he is considered the chief architect of the 1971 Bangladesh genocide. Yahya Khan's presidency oversaw marital law by suspending the constitution in 1969. Holding the country's first general election in 1970, he delayed the power of transition, and in March 1971, Khan ordered Operation Searchlight in an effort to suppress Bengali nationalism. This led to the Bangladesh Liberation War in March 1971. Now, Khan was central to the perpetration of Bangladesh genocide, in which around 300,000 to 3 million Bengalis died, and between 200,000 to 400,000 women were taken advantage of. In December 1971, Pakistan carried out preemptive strikes against the Bengali allied Indian Army, culminating the start of the Third Indian-Pakistan War. Now, the wars resulted in the surrender of Pakistan, and East Pakistan seceded as Bangladesh. After Pakistan's surrender, Khan resigned from the military command and transferred the presidency. Khan's short regime is regarded as the leading cause of the breakup of Pakistan. He is viewed negatively in both Bangladesh, being considered the chief architect of genocide, and in Pakistan. Number 2. Pol Pot. Pol Pot was a Cambodian revolutionary, dictator, and politician who ruled Cambodia as the Prime Minister of Democrat Kampuchea between 1976 and 1979. He was a leading member of Cambodia's communist movement, the Khmer Rouge, from 1963 to 1997 and served as General Secretary of the Communist Party of Kampuchea from 1963 to 1981. Now, his administration converted Cambodia into a one-party communist state and perpetrated the Cambodian genocide. Pot planned to turn Cambodia into a simple, agrarian, and socialist society. He forced the urban population, such as teachers, doctors, and other professionals, into the countryside, onto collective farms, and executed anyone who complained or broke rules by a pickaxe. There was more than 150 detention centers for any dissidents. S-21, the most notorious one, had 7 survivors out of 20,000. Others were taken to fields, executed, and buried in mass graves. Now, he also outlawed religion, most reading, money, anything private, and strictly governed sexual relations, vocabulary, and clothing. Out of a country of not even 10 million people, it's estimated up to 3 million people died in just 3 years. Number 1. Queen Ravaloa. Queen Ravaloa was known as the Mad Queen of Madagascar, and I feel like that explains a lot. She finally ascended to the throne on August 4th, 1829, where she immediately took out all her rivals. She had expelled the European merchants, teachers, diplomats, and trade deals with Britain and France were immediately cancelled. After one successful battle against an invasion, she slit the heads of Europeans, stuck them on pikes, and lined them in the beaches. Now, she also banned the teachings of Christianity, and she had many evil techniques to punish people, as her descendants and criminals would be dumped slowly in boiling water or oil, or tied down with ropes and burned alive. She would place others into coffins, and some were buried into holes with dirt showered upon them. She sold her subjects into slavery to boost her country's economy, which which involved brutal labor conditions, staying far away from homes, and malnutrition-related deaths. Now, these people were either considered traitors, victims of war, non-taxpayers, or Christians who secretly practiced their religion. Her reign brought down the nation's population from 5 million to 2.5 million at the end of her rule. Coming in at number 10 is the Menendez brothers. On the evening of August 20th, 1989, Jose and Kitty Menendez were standing in the den of their Beverly Hills mansion when their sons Lyle and Eric entered the room and shot them to death. Immediately after the deaths, both brothers remained in the house, expecting the police to respond due to the noise of the gunshots. When the police arrived, the brothers told them that the deaths had occurred while they were out at a movie theater seeing Batman and attending the Taste of LA festival. After the deaths, they started spending millions of dollars from their inheritance. They were even spotted with their courtside tickets to see the Knicks play. Incidentally, a photo of Mark Jackson from that game was used as his 1990 basketball card, and you'll never guess who was in the background. It was the brothers. Now, this made people suspicious, and after an alleged confession, the boys were arrested. During the trial, the brothers stated that they committed the crimes out of fear that their father would end their lives after they threatened to expose him for years of sexual, emotional, and physical mistreatment, while the prosecution argued that they did it to inherit their father's multi-million-dollar estate. Both brothers were eventually convicted on 2 counts of first-degree homicide and conspiracy to commit homicide in the penalty phase of the trial. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 9. Philip Chisholm. Philip Chisholm was just a freshman when he ended the life of his math teacher, Colleen Ritzer. Colleen was known to go out of her way to help her students and had asked Philip to stay after school. Then on the morning of October 22nd, 2013, the high school's newly installed security camera system showed Philip arriving at school with several bags which contained a box cutter, mask, gloves, and a change of clothing. The school security footage showed Colleen exiting the classroom towards the second floor women's bathroom, and Philip can be seen walking into the hallway looking her way, pulling his hood over his head, and pulling on gloves as he entered the same bathroom. In the bathroom, Philip proceeded to rob Colleen of her credit cards, iPhone, and her underwear before taking advantage and stabbing her 16 times in the neck with the box cutter. He then put her body in a recycling bin and left it behind the school. Now, him following her and having her body in the recycling bin was all caught on camera, and it makes me sick. The footage of him walking with the recycling bin looks so normal, you'd never know what he did. Now, when police caught him the following morning, Philip had not washed his hands and he still had her blood all over them. He was arrested on February 26, 2016, and he was sentenced to serve at least 40 years in prison. Number 8. Rodney Alcala. In 1978, the dating game show host made history by introducing a man named Rodney Alca as Bachelor number 1. Now, this man won the episode, but the Bachelorette refused to go out with him, citing that he made her uncomfortable. Well, good job she went with her gut, because unknown to the show's producers, Rodney had held a criminal charge of attempted homicide at the time of his television appearance. Now, at this time, he had also ended the lives of at least 5 women. His spree began in the 1960s and ended with his capture in the 1970s. 2 years after his appearance on the show, he was sentenced to death for ending the life of Robin Sanso, and he was also suspected of ending the lives of others. Rodney later appealed his sentencing twice, with each appeal returning a verdict of guilty. Sadly, despite these convictions, investigators believe that he may have had even more victims than we know, and it's crazy that he was able to get on TV though, and thank goodness the woman didn't go out with him. Number 7. Joseph James DeAngelo. Joseph James DeAngelo, aka the Golden State Killer, was a former police officer who ended the lives of 13 people, took advantage of 50 people, and had been involved in 120 burglaries in California between 1974 and 1986. He is responsible for at least 3 separate crime sprees throughout the state, each of which spawned a different nickname in the press before it became evident that they were committed by the same person. He was also linked to hundreds of incidents of thefts, burglaries, vandalism, peeping, stalking, and prowling. Now, he wasn't arrested until 2018, when DNA tracing from family members on a genealogy site linked him to his crimes. In June 2020, he pleaded guilty to 13 deaths and 13 counts of taking advantage of people. In August of the same year, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, his crimes finally caught up to him, and he probably never would have been caught if it wasn't for his family member using that site. Number 6. Robert Allen Durst. Robert Allen Durst gained attention as the suspect in the unsolved 1982 disappearance of his first wife Kathleen McCormick, the 2000 death of his longtime friend Susan Berman, and the 2001 death of his neighbor Morris Black. Acquitted of ending Morris's life in 2003, Robert did not face significant further legal action until his participation in the 2015 documentary miniseries The Jinx, which led to him being charged with Susan's death. After his interview for the show, he took a bathroom break. His mic was still on, which he didn't know, and in the bathroom he said to himself, "There it is, you're caught, you're right of course, oh I want this, killed them all, of course, I want to do something new, there's nothing new about that, what a disaster, he was right, I was wrong, what the hell did I do?" Now due to this, he was convicted of the death in 2021 and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He was charged with Kathleen's disappearance shortly after his sentencing, but died in 2022 before a trial could begin. It's scary that he lied all this time, and also I can't imagine what the sound guy did when he heard this confession, because that is absolutely terrifying. If only Robert did not speak out loud to himself, he might have never been caught. Number 5. Juan David Ortiz. Juan David Ortiz is a former US Border Patrol agent who worked as an intelligence supervisor in Laredo, Texas. In 2018, he was assigned to assist the Texas Rangers in a homicide investigation of 4 women. A few weeks later, when an escaped victim identified him, the Rangers discovered that Juan was the one who was committing the crimes. Just 2 weeks before Juan's arrest, investigators had found the body of a woman with a gunshot wound to the head and wrist. When a second victim was found with similar wounds, it raised suspicions of a serial slayer on the loose. The Texas Rangers then approached Border Control for assistance, and Juan, being an intelligence supervisor, was chosen for the job. Now by the time he was caught, he had committed 2 more homicides, bringing his total number of victims to 4. Number 4. Stephen McDaniel. On June 26, 2011, Stephen McDaniel ended the life of Lauren Gidding. They lived in neighboring apartments and were former classmates at Mercer University. According to Stephen, at 4:30 a.m. on Sunday, June 26, 2011, he used a master key to gain access into Lauren's apartment. Wearing a mask and gloves, he strangled her to death with his hands in her bedroom. The next day, he dismembered her body in the bathroom with a hacksaw. Most of Lauren's remains were discarded in a dumpster on campus. However, the torso was thrown in a trash can outside the apartment complex. Now, on the first day she was announced missing, Stephen played dumb when police asked where she was. On June 30th, 2011, a live TV reporter interviewed Stephen about Lauren, and during it, he was visibly shocked to learn that police had found a section of her body in a nearby dumpster. Had the police cars not blocked this dumpster from being emptied, it's likely that there may have been no indication of her actual fate. Now in 2014, Stephen accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to homicide. His deal required him to describe his account of the crime, and in exchange he would avoid the death penalty. He'll now be eligible for parole in 2041. Number 3. Chris Watts. In the early hours of August 13th, 2018, American oil field operator Chris Watts ended the life of his wife Shanann and their 2 daughters. He buried his wife in a shallow grave near an oil storage facility and dumped his daughters' bodies into crude oil tanks. Chris initially maintained his innocence in his family's disappearance, but unfortunately for him, he seemed too calm about the whole ordeal, so they brought him in for an interview. Chris then kept referring to his wife and daughters in the past tense, which is strange because if he is hoping and believing that they're still alive, why would he start talking about them in the past tense? Now on August 15th, he was arrested after admitting to ending his wife's life, and he later admitted to ending the lives of his daughters too. On November 6, 2018, he pleaded guilty to multiple counts of first-degree homicide as part of a plea deal with the death penalty, and was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, 3 to be served consecutively. Now as Chris went on to plead guilty to all the deaths, investigators were left without answers as to why he ended the lives of his entire family. Afterwards, investigators were able to speak with Chris in prison, and Chris admitted to ending his wife's life after telling her he didn't love her anymore. Now to make matters worse, Chris said that his daughters were alive and in the car with him as he drove Shanann's body to the burial site. As he told investigators, after burying Shanann, he smothered his youngest daughter and deposited her body in a tank, all while his other daughter was watching, and he then did the same thing to her. Number 2, Adam Strong. 2 young women had their lives ended and dismembered by Adam Strong almost a decade apart. It was plumbers working on Adam's home that made the gruesome discovery. They called the cops after finding a flesh-like substance in the pipes. Yeah, he put the remains down his sink and was shocked when the pipes eventually got clogged. When cops knocked on Adam's door, he reportedly told them, "Okay, you got me, the jig's up, it's a body. If you want to recover the rest of her, it's in my freezer." Now, in his interrogation video, he's very proud of what he's done and makes sure the police have all the evidence they need against him. He says, "How much of her body did you get back? Obviously the entire skeletal structure, right? And how much were you able to pull out of the pipes?" He literally admitted to everything. Now, the way he's so nonchalant and even excited about this is truly frightening, and the fact that he may have even been able to get away with it is terrifying. And coming in at number 1 is Samuel Little. Samuel Little was the most prolific serial slayer in American history with 60 confirmed victims, although police believe that there are more victims. By the time of his death in 2020, Samuel had confessed to ending the lives of 93 people between 1970 and 2005. Now, most of the slayings took place in Florida and Southern California. Almost all of his victims were women, many of them prostitutes, drug addicts, or poor people living on the edges of society. They were individuals that he said he believed would leave few people behind to look for them, and not much evidence for police to follow. Indeed, local authorities in states across the country initially classified many of the deaths as accidents, drug overdoses, or the result of an unknown cause. He evaded detection by police for decades until he was arrested in California on a narcotics charge in 2012. DNA evidence then linked him to 3 unsolved homicides from the 1980s. He was handed 3 life sentences, 1 for each death, and given no chance of parole. Since then, he's confessed to 93 deaths, which investigators have no reason to doubt he committed.
At number 10 is the Hachishaku-sama. Known as the Japanese Slender Man, this Japanese legend makes Slender Man seem like a walk in the park. First up, she's tall. I mean, imagine peeking out your window and seeing an 8-foot tall lady staring back at you. Instant chills. And when she gets close, she makes this spine-tingling sound like kind of giving you a heads up that she's coming. But here's where it gets really scary. She only goes after individuals who haven't been on Earth for very long. Why? Well, some think it's because she feeds off their energy or potential, and also because they're easier to lure. Plus, she can mimic voices, even your loved ones, trying to trick you into opening up your door, and poof, you're gone. And get this, once you see her, you're pretty much marked for doom. There's a ritual to shake her off, and it involves some Buddha statues, salt, and leaving Japan forever. Pretty tough deal. Oh, and she rocks this long white dress, a classic ghostly choice, but the kicker is that she can actually appear as quite attractive, despite being so tall, which makes her scarier. In a nutshell, she's like this vengeful spirit ramped up with this scary look, an eerie sound, and a taste for younger people. Super spooky. At number 9 is the Highway of Tears Unaliver. Now, while the US normally comes to mind when thinking about serial unaliver phenomena, Canada is actually home to a plethora of unsolved serial unalivings. Great. The notorious Highway of Tears in British Columbia, spanning 450 miles between Prince George and Prince Rupert, harbors a haunting legacy of tragedy. Approximately 18 to 40 individuals, primarily indigenous women, have either disappeared or met a tragic end along this route from 69 to 2011. This chilling series of incidents spans over 5 decades, indicating the potential involvement of multiple perpetrators. Law enforcement, particularly the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, faced immense challenges in solving these cases. Regrettably, only 1 unaliving led to prosecution, leaving 17 other cases unsolved. The complexity lies in the multiple unalivers suspected lurking along the highway, making tracking their actions over the years incredibly difficult. While authorities have linked 1 individual to a couple of the unalivings, the majority remain unattributed. The shadow of these unsolved cases suggests the likely existence of additional culprits who have yet to be apprehended. If you're enjoying this spooky video so far, please support the channel by pressing like, subscribing to Most Amazing, and ringing that notification bell. I don't see why not, because it is free, and it helps us out, so Please do that. At number 8 is the Sitter. The Oakland County minor unaliver, also referred to as the Sitter, was an unidentified serial assailant responsible for the unalivings of at least 4 young people in Oakland County, Michigan between 76 and 77. This individual earned the moniker due to a pattern observed in the crimes where each victim was bathed before the tragic events, leading the authorities to speculate on potential psychological motives behind the unaliver's actions. The impact of the crimes reverberated profoundly, causing widespread fear and concern among parents throughout Michigan. Numerous community watch programs were initiated, emphasizing the need for heightened vigilance and safety measures for the vulnerable. Despite exhaustive investigative efforts and several leads, including a vehicle linked to the perpetrator, the case still remains unsolved. A significant breakthrough occurred in 2012 when a DNA profile was obtained, but unfortunately, no match was found within law enforcement databases or associated with any arrests made in connection to the case. The extended duration of the victim's captivity, lasting from several days to nearly 3 weeks, adds to the disturbing nature of these tragic events. Number 7 is the Smiling Man. The Smiling Man is a chilling narrative that comes from someone's real experience on a late night walk. This story was shared on a Reddit forum called r/let's-not-meet. So now the thing is, this thread is for real-life encounters, not made-up stories. It describes an eerie encounter with a man on a quiet Seattle street, and it goes a little something like this. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I enjoyed taking late-night walks to pass the time, but one night, while strolling near a quiet park, something eerie happened. As I turned onto a side street, I noticed a man dancing in the distance. The movement seemed odd, like a waltz with an unusual forward step. Initially, I assumed he might be intoxicated, so I moved to give him some space. However, as he drew nearer, his graceful movements surprised me. His appearance was unsettling. He was tall, thin, and wore an old suit. His eyes were wide, gazing up into the sky, and his smile seemed unnatural. I decided to cross the street, feeling uncomfortable, but when I glanced back, he stood motionless, staring at me with that unsettling smile. Though I tried to put distance between us, he vanished briefly, only to reappear even closer. Feeling unnerved, I quickly walked away, yet each time I looked back, he appeared closer and closer. This continued until he started to move rapidly towards me. Despite feeling frozen in fear, I eventually fled to a more illuminated area, losing sight of the creepy smiling man. At number 6 is the expressionless woman. Now this one is just demonic. There was an infamous incident in 1972 at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles when a woman, devoid of any facial expression akin to that of a mannequin, enters the hospital's premise, her gown stained with the bodily fluids of a kitten with its remains still clenched in her jaw. The hospital staff tried to aid her, but things took a nightmarish turn. After a brief cooperation, she turned hostile, attacking the staff. Security intervention led to her biting a guard's jugular. When questioned about her identity, she ominously declared herself as God before just vanishing, leaving behind the legend of the expressionless woman. At number 5 is the Graveyard Demon of Dagestan. This was a spooky legend in Russian history. Different folks in Dagestan told stories about this eerie creature, and they all had a similar picture in mind. They saw it as a tall, thin thing dressed in white, sometimes with a face you couldn't see. Could be invisible or look like a real being. Now, the demon liked to hang out in graveyards or empty houses, making creepy sounds at night. Some folks thought only bad people could see it, while others believed it could scare anybody. Legend said that the demon was once a person who didn't get enough gifts after they passed away, or it was a bad person who turned into this scary thing. The details are not very clear. People who encountered this thing felt weak or sick afterwards, like it drained their energy. Some thought you could prevent bad stuff by saying some special prayers or doing rituals like hanging an empty eggshell or nail to protect the living from their relatives. Kinda weird. At number 4 is the Roanoke Demon. Roanoke Island's tale is a fascinating mystery from American history. That rhymed. In the late 16th century, a group of English settlers arrived at Roanoke in what is now North Carolina. They established a colony, but things took a bizarre turn when their colony leader, John White, went back to England for supplies. When White returned a few years later, he found the settlement deserted with no signs of struggle or battle. The clues were dismantled, and the only clue left behind was the word Croatoan carved on a post, and crow on a nearby tree. Now, some people think that the settlers might have integrated with local natives, the Croatoans, but there's another chilling theory. Now, I'm gonna assert that this claim comes from the internet and not from the Croatoans themselves, but supposedly, legends among the Native American tribes spoke of an ancient ritual to summon a powerful entity, a demon, meant to protect their land from intruders. It's said that this ritual was performed when they felt their territory was threatened by outsiders, and according to these legends, the settlers' disappearance might have been linked to this ritual, a desperate attempt by the indigenous people to protect their land from the encroaching colonizers. At number 3 is the Zerdiaj. Imagine a creature wandering the streets at night, peeking through windows and giving everybody the creeps. Meet the Zerdiaj, a character from Russian folklore. The Zerdiaj was super tall and skinny, like a long tree trunk without its branches. Sort of like a sad wanderer, condemned to wander aimlessly forever. People don't really know much about him, just that he liked scaring folks by peeking into their homes or warming his hands in chimneys. But here's where it gets more interesting. Some stories link Zerdiaj to a big bad guy named Koshchi the Immortal. Koshchi was a typical bad dude in Slavic tales, a skinny tall elder or a wandering skeleton who used magic and kidnapped little people. And guess what? No hero could easily beat him. Now, we're not totally sure about the connection between these two characters, because there's not a lot of info about these guys in Russian folklore. At number 2 is the Chupacabra Man. The Chupacabra is a legendary creature known for attacking livestock, especially goats, and drinking their bodily fluids like a vampire. But what if I told you that there might be another mysterious figure behind these goat unalivings? In a small Mexican village, farmers have been losing their goats in bizarre ways. Now, most blame the Chupacabra, depicting the mysterious cryptid creature demon thing, but apparently, the Chupacabra might have actually been a real person. It was rumored that this mysterious being had a deep-seated grudge against the farmers, seeking revenge for an ancient betrayal. You see, legend has it that this figure was once a respected herder in the valley. However, when a severe drought struck, the farmers accused him of stealing their water supply to save his own herd, as most of the other farmers' flock had perished, but not his. They then proceeded to totally pillage the dude. However, this farmer lived, vanished into the shadows, and swore vengeance, which he got by, apparently, sucking the juices out of the other farmers' goats. Yeah, seems legit. At number 1 is the Servant Annihilator. This dude takes the top spot, as this unsolved case is actually one of the very first American serial unalivers. Oh goody. This creepy person went around unaliving 7 women and a man in Austin, Texas between 84 and 85. Now what's chilling is that all these victims worked as house helpers, and this guy attacked them while they were sleeping or pulled them out of their homes to unalive them. In one really scary night in 1885, this unaliver used an axe to unalive 3 people, earning himself the nickname the Austin Axe Unaliver. The police back then had a hard time figuring things out, and all the records are pretty spotty since it happened over 125 years ago. Some people think that the Axe Unaliver might have been Jack the Ripper, who caused chaos in London a few years later. However, other people think it's a local guy named Nathan Elgin, who had a distinctive foot with only 4 toes, matching footprints found on the crime scene. He was unalived by a police officer in 1886 while trying to help a woman named Julia from this drunk dude attacking her outside a saloon. Thankfully, this terrifying unaliver is long gone, considering it happened so many years ago. I mean, if it was in fact this dude and not Jack the Ripper. At number 1 is the snowplow. In Ukraine not too long ago, a man dialed to local authorities and confessed to a heinous crime, stabbing his mother's partner. But here's the twist. He also asked the police to bring a snowplow because the snow obstructing his driveway made it really hard to reach him. The police were quick to respond, only to find out that the supposed victim was unharmed. As it turns out, the confession was just a ploy to get the cops to clear the snow around his place. You see, he was supposed to shovel it himself, but he was too lazy. So he figured if he faked the crime, the police would clear the snow for him. Well, his plan ended up backfiring big time. Now he's in trouble for wasting police resources. It's a bizarre and somewhat understandable situation, but the law doesn't take kindly to crying wolf, or in this case, crying unaliving. At number 10, you have to arrest me. One fateful day, a man who claimed to be Nathaniel Leonard walked into a police station. He confessed to unspeakable crimes and handed over detailed evidence, claiming responsibility for multiple heinous acts. Unalivings that, according to him, were meticulously planned and executed. The evidence Leonard presented was chilling. Photographs, journals, and disturbingly precise accounts of each crime. He pleaded with the authorities, practically begging to be incarcerated. However, as the police delved deeper into Leonard's confessions, an unsettling reality emerged. They meticulously cross-checked his claims, searched for any signs of missing persons matching his descriptions, or evidence of the gruesome acts he committed. Yet, to their confoundment, they found nothing. No missing people, no corroborative evidence, nothing that could substantiate Leonard's horrifying confessions. As a matter of fact, they couldn't even find evidence of his own existence. The apartment he claimed to rent had been occupied by another tenant, and even his supposed place of work claimed to never have known him. Despite his pleas, there was no legal ground to charge Leonard with any crime, and with no identifiable victims, no evidence beyond what was circumstantial, the hands of justice were tied. The police released Leonard back into the world, where he was never heard from again. The man who yearned for imprisonment, seeking absolution through punishment, slipped away into obscurity, leaving a community bewildered and haunted by the specter of his confessions that couldn't be proven. But perhaps in the universe next door, the families of those affected by his atrocities still seek justice. At number 9 is the time-traveling serial unaliver. The stories of a series of gruesome unalivings that happened between 89 and 91. The perpetrator, later identified as Jonathan Carter, was a seemingly ordinary man with an extraordinary claim. He professed to be a time traveler from the future on a mission to prevent catastrophic events by taking lives in the present. Jonathan's bizarre modus operandi and cryptic messages left investigators dumbfounded. Each victim was meticulously chosen, with Jonathan citing their futures as catalysts for impending disaster. He believed that eliminating these individuals would alter the course of history, preventing an event that would devastate the world. As the bodies piled up and Jonathan's confessions became more elaborate, the authorities struggled to comprehend his twisted rationale. Now, during the trial, Jonathan maintained his unwavering belief in his mission. He spoke calmly of a future apocalypse, asserting that his actions were a necessary sacrifice to avert global catastrophe. However, the court, unable to accept such outlandish claims, found him guilty on multiple counts of unaliving. Despite pleas from some who believed his delusionary mission and others who argued for mental health evaluation, the justice system prevailed and Jonathan Carter was sentenced to lethal injection for his heinous crimes. Jonathan maintained his story until his very last breath. His last words? "I wasn't finished. You're all doomed." If you're enjoying the video so far, please support the channel by pressing like, subscribing to Most Amazing, and ringing that notification bell. At number 8 is the Philip Fraser disappearance. Philip Fraser was heading home from college, which was a crazy long drive from Alaska to Maryland. On his way, he picked up a hitchhiker, even though he'd initially said no. See, the hitchhiker seemed off, and he was later described by cafe staff as seeming as though he had just busted out of a mental institution. Later on, this hitchhiker got picked up by another couple because he claimed that his car was acting up. But get this, he claimed that he was the real Philip, acting all sus and carrying 2 wallets. Then things went bonkers as Philip's car was later found burned up in the woods, but with no sign of him or a struggle. The police faced a dead end as both the hitchhiker and Fraser were never seen again, almost as if they were whisked away into a parallel universe. At number 7 is the Ben Padilla plane jacking. In 2003, Ben Padilla and a mechanic pulled off a real Houdini act. They snuck into this Boeing 747, chilling at an Angolan airport, revved it up, and zoom, off they went, never to be seen again. No plane, no bad guys, nada. Now, Ben's family has been on the hunt to solve this mystery. Some reckon that Ben didn't sign up for this joyride willingly. They suspect he was forced into playing pilot. Sadly to say, chances are that Ben might not be around anymore. Once the plane reached its mysterious destination, those involved probably had to cover their tracks. The big puzzle pieces? Who's the mastermind behind this airborne escapade, and where is that colossal 747 hiding now? At number 6 is the Great War in Britain reality. This is a story I found on r/nosleep by a user named Albert Norman that also comes with some screenshots to back up his claims. So picture this, instead of the regular music on the radio, his Monday morning's radio station is talking about the victory in the Great War. There's nothing like that happening, right? News, people at work, even in the streets were talking about this victory in Italy and something about a second Great Depression ending. Things went from weird to weirder when he entered his workplace and nobody seemed to know who he was. On top of that, the city looked run down, things were falling apart, and the news was talking about wars and chaos all over Europe. To make sense of this, the user checked out Wikipedia and found some crazy stuff, like Europe was in chaos, wars were happening, economies were crashing harder than ever. To make sure they weren't dreaming, they took screenshots of everything, and guess what? When they woke back in our reality, the pictures were still there. At number 5 is the Shadow Man. Some say that ghosts and the supernatural are really just our universe briefly intertwining with another, which makes the following story from Reddit so much scarier. Picture this, a tall, shadowy figure wearing a suit and a top hat. The user had been seeing this thing since they were little and had been messing with them big time. At first they thought they were just imagining stuff, being a kid and all, but as they got older, it grew stronger, turning off lights, messing around with sinks, and moving things around. Fast forward, and they thought it'd be cool to play around with the Ouija board, which was a bad idea. Things went from weird to terrifying real quick, as that shadow dude he'd been seeing for years, turns out he was now tied to the board, and he got super intense, actually scratching the person and leaving bruises. They tried everything to get rid of it, like holy water, tossing the board, but nothing worked. Now, the Shadow Man is still around, causing havoc. The homie who wrote this is desperate for any ideas to make it stop. Moral of the story, don't mess around with the paranormal, because it's no joke. And number 4 is Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip brought German scientists to the US after World War II for various projects, including the Manhattan Project, which went on to produce the nuclear bomb. Fun fact that I didn't know before scripting this video, actually the founder of NASA was part of this Operation Paperclip, having worked closely with Hitler, which is pretty scary. Now, aside from NASA and the Manhattan Project, there are a bunch of other projects still classified to this day that the US had the Germans working on. Some details about what happened to certain scientists after the contracts ended remain unclear, leading to speculations and rumors. When the tenure of some of these scientists ended, poof, they just disappeared off the radar. Records showed that the government assigned them to other various projects, top secret stuff, but all those paper trails just seem to vanish into thin air. Now here's where it gets wild. There are whispers that some of these scientists, after their Manhattan gig, these geniuses weren't just twiddling their thumbs. Some say that the government had them working on a wild experiment, opening a wormhole to another dimension. Did they pull it off? Did they flee to Argentina? Or hold your breath, did they skip into an alternate reality? Nobody knows. Maybe they're sipping tea in a parallel universe, laughing at us all trying to figure out. At number 3, Lars Madanik's strange behavior during his Bulgaria trip is a real head scratcher. After a brawl over soccer teams that seriously messed up his ear, he stuck around for a few days to heal while his friends left without him. But his behavior got even weirder, texting his family about safety concerns and asking them to cancel his credit card. When he tried to fly back home a week later, things got even more bizarre. At the airport, he wanted a doctor's thumbs up due to his ear injury, but then he bolted out of that office like a lightning bolt, vanishing without a trace. The details on Lars's actions before that moment paint a kinda confusing picture. His mates noticed that he wasn't eating much and acted offbeat while they were there. They said that he hardly ate during the vacation, wasn't keen on food I guess, and had a showdown over soccer before his ear took a hit. Now, did all this stir up a mental storm? Consider this, and it's just a theory, but could this possibly have been a precursor to a psychotic episode? Signs like odd behavior, eating and sleeping changes, aggression, and delusions can precede it. Not to mention, if he received enough head trauma to bust open his ear, he's probably gonna have a few screws loose up in his noggin. Or maybe he just disappeared into a parallel universe. At number 2 is Tupac. The disappearance of Tupac, the influential rapper and cultural icon, remains one of the most perplexing mysteries in the music industry. After the tragic shooting incident in '96 that led to his untimely demise, or so it was believed, rumors and conspiracy theories about his disappearance began to circulate, seeing as there had been reported sightings of him all throughout Cuba, even though he had just passed away. Now, one theory to explain this was that this Cuban Tupac was actually from another universe. Numerous eyewitnesses attested to seeing Tupac in various locations after his reported demise, fueling the belief that he had somehow transcended into another dimension, maybe even transcended the state of being unalive itself. Reports of sightings in secluded areas, coupled with purported encounters where he showcased an uncharacteristic demeanor, add weight to the notion that Tupac may have slipped into an alternate reality. Despite extensive investigations by law enforcement and dedicated fans tirelessly scrutinizing every detail, no conclusive evidence of Tupac's fate or whereabouts have ever emerged. At number 1, we live in the wrong reality. I thought I would finish this off here today with an eerie story from r/NoSleep. The post is called The Truth About Parallel Universes, and it goes something like this. It's a bit long, so bear with me. I'm from a parallel universe, and for the moment, I'm stuck here. No, I don't mean I experienced a glitch in the Matrix, nor do I mean I erroneously remember Mandela dying in prison and concluded being from a parallel universe is a much more plausible explanation than the unreliability of human memory. I mean, I deliberately came here from a parallel universe using a machine developed by generations of scientists. Being here, I feel obligated to share some information with you that you're not aware of due to the fact that you haven't developed the technology to travel between parallel realities. The knowledge I'm going to share with you is going to upset a lot of you. You see, universe hopping is quite common in other realities. Now, one thing you guys got right in sci-fi is that parallel universes are pretty similar to each other. So when one goes universe hopping, for lack of a better term, it's standard procedure to exchange all the information about parallel universes we know of between each other, and all this data is accessible to us. Now, for some reason, your universe in the Sumerian civilization fell instead of acting as a great unifying force, eventually bringing the Roman, Egyptian, and Chinese empires into international union. What you call the Enlightenment happened some 2,000 years too late from my perspective. The bubonic plague never happened anywhere else. When your Europeans reached what you call the Americas, not only did you not know who they were, but you inadvertently, and later very intentionally, disseminated the native population by infecting them with diseases that they had no natural immunity to. How you understand how truly exceptional this is, there are literally only 4 other universes where this contact happened before the invention of vaccines, and there are no universes in which the Americas didn't have their own international Union. To put things into perspective before you, the least technologically advanced reality we found had just finished colonizing the entire solar system. You're all living in the worst version of reality. That was pretty depressing. I really hope that's not true. Coming up first at number 10 is Carl Panzram, a guy who took crime to a whole new level. You see, for 18 years, he made crime his full-time job, robbing, and ending people's lives all over the place, even across countries and oceans. Nobody even knew who he was until 1928, when he spilled the beans on his own horrific life. In a seriously grim autobiography, he admitted to unaliving 21 people, committing countless robberies, and even committing SA to over 1,000 guys. And guess what? He felt zero remorse for any of it. He straight up hated everybody, including himself. His only friend was his jailer, Henry Lesser. They met in jail where Panzram was locked up for trying to steal a stolen radio. He bragged about way worse stuff though, like his habit of ending people to, quote, reform them. This is super crazy. At first, everybody in jail thought he was just trying to show off, considering he was only there for petty theft. But then, he spilled details about 3 unsolved unalivings, making it clear that he was no ordinary criminal. Turns out his messed up life started early. Born poor in 1891, he got into trouble young and was sent to a harsh reformatory where things only got worse. As he grew up, he jumped from place to place, learning crime tricks along the way. Even when he joined the army, he got booted out for not working. Prison didn't change him either. He just learned to say what people wanted to hear to get out. His crimes got seriously twisted when he stole from a big shot who once punished him. With the loot, he bought a boat and then went on an unaliving spree worldwide. He'd get people drunk, them, then shoot them and dump their bodies in the sea, sometimes relying on crocodiles to consume all the evidence. After getting caught for the small aforementioned crime, he went on trial and got 25 years in prison. But he messed up again by ending a guard. At his final trial, he didn't even defend himself, admitting he was guilty. He showed no fear when he was hanged, leaving behind a brutal legacy that took decades to tell. At number 9 is Albert Fish. Imagine reading a detailed letter from your family member's tormentor detailing the events leading to your loved one's demise. Pretty gruesome. Albert Fish confessed to unspeakable crimes, and he earned names like the Gray Man and the Brooklyn Vampire due to his horrifying deeds. He described in shocking detail how he asphyxiated, cooked, and consumed a youth named Grace Budd. It's hard to fathom such cruelty. This man not only ended lives, but also claimed to have taken 9 days to eat Grace's entire body. The gruesomeness of his actions is beyond comprehension. Police used the information on the stationery paper Fish used to locate and detain him. Fish never denied the crime. He was executed by electric chair in 1936 in New York's Sing Sing Correctional Facility. If you're enjoying this video so far, please support the channel by pressing like, subscribing to Most Amazing, and ringing that notification bell. At number 8 is Richard Kuklinski. Richard Kuklinski was a hitman. You know, somebody who, well, ended lives for money. He was called the Iceman. So in this interview back in '91, he talked about one time where he gave a guy he was going to end some time to pray to God, thinking that maybe God could change things. He gave the guy 30 minutes saying, hey, if God's going to save you, this is going to be the moment. But guess what? Nothing happened. No divine intervention, no God showing up like in the movies. Kaczynski later said that he felt bad about that one. Pretty chilling. This guy who did all kinds of terrible things felt regret for that one particular unaliving. At number 7, Samuel Little was no ordinary guy. Born in Georgia, he didn't have an easy start. His mom reportedly left him, and he grew up with his grandma. School wasn't his thing, so he dropped out and started wandering around. Trouble seemed to follow him everywhere. He did all sorts of bad stuff. Between 1957 and 75, he got arrested 26 times in 11 states. Stealing, fighting, and even more serious things like SA and trying to end somebody. He was like a magnet for problems. In '82, they thought he ended a woman named Melina Lepre, but they couldn't prove it, so he got off the hook. Then there were more serious incidents, attacking a woman, stealing, driving under the influence. He just couldn't stay out of trouble. The only steady thing in his life was his girlfriend, Aurelia, who he met in jail. People later suspected she knew about his crimes, as they traveled a lot together, and she rented rooms that matched the places where unalivings happened. He finally got caught in 2012 for substances, and when they checked his DNA, they found connections to 3 unsolved unalivings. He denied it, but got locked up for life. Later, he started confessing to a lot more. Like, a lot more. He admitted to at least 93 unalivings. It's scary because he was so good at making it look like they died from something else. But DNA evidence wasn't a thing back then, so some cases were hard to prove. His confessions shocked everyone, and the FBI confirmed at least 50 of those unalivings.
And we're starting out this list with Grigory Rasputin. Born in 1869 in a small Siberian village, he grew up as a peasant. He was also a mystic, and grew up to become quite close with the Russian royal family after seemingly healed Alexei Nikolaevich, the son of Nicholas II and heir to the Russian throne. Alexei was a hemophiliac, meaning his blood didn't clot properly, and Rasputin, after being called to the palace of Nicholas and Alexandra, seemed to ease his symptoms. This was miraculous, and the royal family put their full trust in this mysterious holy man who would go on to have sleeping with any woman he could within the palace, but he was also known to force himself on women. But because Nicholas and Alexandra were so enamored with his supposed power, any concern or report about him was completely written off. It seemed that everyone on the outside wanted the guy gone though, seeing how he was pulling Nicholas and Alexandra's strings, controlling them like puppets, and there were a number of attempts to take Rasputin's life, but this guy was hard to take down. He was stabbed and recovered, poisoned with cyanide, which had no effect. He was shot and was seemingly dead before springing up like Michael Myers at the end of Halloween. He was then shot again before being wrapped up in a blanket and thrown in a river where he finally drowned. Number 9. Gilles de Rais. Born in 1404, Gilles de Rais was a French nobleman and a respected military leader, but he had a secret life. He was responsible for viciously taking the lives of countless young ones and was said to be a practitioner of black magic and conducted occult rituals, leading many to believe that he possessed otherworldly abilities. This guy was an absolute monster. If you want to talk about true evil, this is it right here. His servants, mostly young men, very young men, and other young ones around his castles, started going missing, and rumors started to spread that Gilles de Rais was disposing of them, something that turned out to be true when witnesses began seeing servants disposing of bodies. Many were afraid to speak out against him, though, due to the immense gap in class that was present at the time. He was finally arrested in 1440, though, and under the threat of excruciating punishment, he admitted to his crimes, actually revealing that he would take the lives of his victims in these dark, occult-like rituals. Next on the list, we have Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory, born August 7th, 1560, was a Hungarian noblewoman notorious for being one of the most prolific female serial killers in history. She's often remembered as the Blood Countess because of her horrifying crimes. Bathory was accused of tormenting and taking the lives of numerous young females. Her methods included severe beatings, burning, and disfigurement. And what she's most famous for, though, was her belief that bathing in her victim's blood would preserve her youth. It's said that she may have taken the lives of hundreds in her quest for eternal beauty. Her actions eventually caught the attention of authorities. In 1610, she was arrested and her accomplices were put on trial, and the accounts from witnesses and survivors painted a very chilling picture of her cruelty. She was never officially tried in court, but was confined to a windowless room in her castle until her death in 1614. Number 7. Aleister Crowley. Crowley, born in 1875, was an English occultist and ceremonial magician, founded the religion of Thelema. He was a prominent and very controversial guy, especially at the time, known as the Great Beast 666. He was an occultist, writer, and ceremonial magician, a man of many mysteries and oddities. Crowley was known for more than just his eccentric lifestyle, though. One of the big questions surrounding him is whether he actually had any mystical powers or was just really good at talking the talk. Crowley wasn't shy about bragging that he could communicate with supernatural beings. He claimed to have a direct line to a being named Aiwass, who supposedly dictated to him the book of the law, basically the Bible of Thelema. Then there's the curious case of his rituals. Crowley was all about strange ceremonies, often involving weird symbols and chants, and even some bizarre sexual practices. As to whether he was evil, I mean, some would definitely say he was, but yeah, certainly not like most of the others on this list. Like this next guy, for example. And at number 6, Thug Behram. Thug Behram, born in 1765, became infamous as the ruthless leader of the Thuggee cult in India during the 18th and 19th centuries. The Thuggee were a secret criminal society that specialized in robbery and murder, targeting unsuspecting travelers. What made the Thuggee particularly sinister was their method of operation. They would often befriend and gain the trust of their victims on the road, only to then strangle them with a rummel, a cloth, and this kind of ritualistic fashion, allowing them to carry out their crimes discreetly. Behram was one of the most notorious Thuggee leaders, believed to have taken the lives of hundreds. He actually admitted to witnessing 931 people die right in front of him, and that's not even counting the ones he had a direct hand in. Under his leadership, the thugs terrorized India for years with a well-organized network that spanned the country. He was eventually captured and put to death in 1840. Next, we have H.H. Holmes. Holmes was born in 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. Although he was highly intelligent from a young age, he displayed all your classic disturbing signs early on. He would capture and torture animals, cutting into them and performing strange experiments. Holmes, whose real name was Herman Webster Mudgett, not quite as intimidating sounding, committed crimes that were as horrifying as they were calculated. He constructed this nightmarish castle in Chicago, specifically equipped with secret passageways and soundproof rooms and gas chambers, which were all made to assist with his gruesome crimes. He would lure numerous victims, mostly young women, surprise, surprise, into his property, and once inside, they came face to face with unimaginable horrors, including excruciating torment, asphyxiation, and dissection. The exact number of his victims isn't 100% known, but it could be anywhere from just 9 to over 200. I'm guessing it's somewhere in between. In 1896, he was finally convicted for his crimes and sentenced to death. Number 4, Gil Garnier. Here we have a real-life werewolf case, at least the closest thing possible. Gil Garnier, aka the Hermit of Saint Benoît and the Werewolf of Dole, was a reclusive man born at some point in the mid-1500s in France. He lived in an isolated home just outside the town of Dole. His new wife moved out to the home with him, and it was at this point that something changed in Garnier. He had always hunted food for himself, but now having to provide for another person, it was difficult, and this started driving a wedge between him and his wife, and he started getting desperate. It was at this point that several young ones in the area started being found mauled to death with parts of their bodies having been eaten. Meaning this had to have been the work of some large animal, right? But it wasn't. It was Garnier. Garnier's crimes came to light when a group of traveling workers had spotted him eating the body of one of his victims in the dead of night. At first, they thought they were looking at a wolf. According to Garnier, he had been hunting one night when a ghostly figure came to him, telling him it would imbue him with the power to transform into a wolf, making it easier for him to hunt. Since that night, he had stalked and hunted a number of young people, most of which died as a result of his savage attacks. He was burnt at the stake in 1574, accused of lycanthropy and witchcraft. I don't know what it was with guys named Gilles in France back then, but they didn't like young folks, apparently. Number 3, Vlad the Impaler, the original vampire himself. If there's anyone in history that just feels like they stepped out of some portal from another dark dimension, it's this guy. Vlad was born in 1431. He was a tyrant renowned for his brutal methods of punishing enemies, often impaling them on long spikes. His reputation for cruelty gave rise to the legend that is Dracula, inspiring Bram Stoker's famous vampire novel. Alongside these gruesome acts, there are legends suggesting Vlad may have possessed otherworldly powers. Tales kind of hint at his ability to control the weather, or summon dark forces, or even transform into a vampire-like creature. The line between fact and fiction often blurs with this guy. Some believe that his cruelty was more than human, that maybe he had something supernatural lurking inside him, some sort of dark entity from beyond. He just inspired this intense fear and awe in his time, and his brutality definitely unquestionable, but the idea of him being an actual vampire, most likely just legend, but fun to imagine. And at number 2, we have Jack the Ripper, a name everyone has heard before. One of the first cases of the type of modern day serial killer we hear about all the time now, only this man was never identified. Jack the Ripper terrorized the Whitechapel district of London in 1888 and remains one of the most infamous figures in criminal history. Victims were taken out in the most gruesome ways possible. They looked like they had been mauled to death by a 500-pound brown bear. Jack primarily targeted female workers of the night, brutally mutilating their bodies. The sheer level of ferocity of these attacks and the fact that he was never caught really has fueled the theories and speculations over the years about him. He taunted the police with letters that were apparently from him, signed as Jack the Ripper. There have been intensive investigations and a number of suspects that have kind of come up over the years that could have been him, but his true identity has never been definitively proven. Finally, we have Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler was a high-ranking German official during World War II. He had a deep and disturbing fascination with the occult. He believed he could summon dark forces to help him shape a new world order and tried to incorporate his beliefs into the ideology of the regime. He established a research institute to explore ancient and supernatural phenomena. Under his direction, he conducted these expeditions to search for evidence of Aryan origins, looking into topics like ancient artifacts, astrology, folklore, and this interest extended to the dark and the occult, as Himmler believed that tapping into these mystical forces would help the German forces gain more power and control. He promoted pseudo-scientific theories, obviously related to racial purity and mysticism, and saw the SS almost as this more modern-day knightly kind of order. Such a bizarre side of the Second World War. It feels like something out of Hellboy, but this really was a thing. The German forces were really dabbling in this type of occult stuff at the time.
At number 10 is the Lucy Unaliving House. In Uniontown, Alabama, stands a once stunning Greek revival mansion that now seems engulfed by the earth. Its tragic history matches its eerie appearance, because in 1994, the Lucy Unaliving House gained notoriety when the remains of Alan Lucy were discovered buried beneath its front porch. Alan, who lived with his adoptive parents, Philip and Margaret Lucy, vanished in 1985. Now what's chilling is that Philip and Margaret's biological son, Jason, had been telling classmates that his father unalived Alan and buried him in the backyard. But no one believed Jason's claims back then, despite earlier rumors about the case took years to resolve, and only after decades when Alan Lucy's unaliving was brought to justice. However, the impact still lingers, as the house remains a haunted relic, reflecting the environmental injustices that have plagued upon Uniontown, driving residents away and leaving those who stayed fighting their own battles for justice. Number 9 is Gary, Indiana, where something eerie lurks amidst all these decaying houses. Around 10,000 abandoned homes scatter across the town, worn down by time and neglect. These empty structures, with their crumbly walls and their worn-out roofs, stand as grim reminders of a once thriving industry that faded away, leaving the town to struggle. These derelict houses now serve as shelters for those with nowhere else to go, or worse yet, are hiding spots for those with sinister intentions. A chilling example of this darkness unfold with serial unaliver Darren Van. Between 2013 and 2014, he took the lives of 7 people, unaliving them and leaving their bodies in these forsaken dwellings. Crimes stayed hidden until he made a fatal mistake, leading to his arrest. His plea deal revealed the grim truth, exposing how these abandoned places provided him with a sinister cover for these horrific acts. The silence of these empty homes shielded his action, raising chilling questions about the lives lost and how much longer his crimes might have remained concealed if he didn't slip up. If you're enjoying this video so far, please support the channel by pressing like, subscribing to Most Amazing, and ringing that notification bell. At number 8 is The Cage. Deep within the quaint village of the St. Oist lies a chilling relic of England's past. The Cage, a haunted house infamous for its eerie history. Originally a medieval prison where alleged witches faced trials and hangings in the 1500s, this place holds a spine-tingling reputation as one of England's haunted spots. 13 accused witches were once held here, and 3 met their demise on site, notably Ursula Kemp in 1582. After its closure as a prison in 1908, ghostly tales continued to swirl around the property. Previous owner Vanessa endured unexplainable phenomena, citing instances of ghostly encounters and poltergeist activities. Her reported experience include unsettling occurrences like being pushed while she was with child by an unseen force and objects mysteriously flying across rooms. Despite lingering spirits, a property found the new order in 2020 after a lengthening 12 years on the market. At number 7 is the Mixyong Ghost House in Taiwan. It was built in 1929 by a rich businessman, but soon after the family left it abandoned. One spooky legend revolves around how a maid who supposedly had an affair with the owner. The owner's wife found out, and she did some bad things to the maid. It said that the maid met her end tragically at the site, jumping into the well on her property, and now her ghost lingers here. Now, later on, the place became a shelter for members of a political party trying to escape persecution. Some say a few of them also chose to unalive themselves here, making the place even more eerie. The story is super chilling. At number 6 is the Los Feliz Unaliving House, a spooky tale tied to a once elegant estate in LA. Back in 1959, Dr. Harold Perelson, a well-known cardiologist, tragically went on a rampage. He attacked his family in the night with a hammer, starting with his wife and the rest of his family. Luckily, the eldest daughter managed to escape and seek help. The house remained frozen in time after this terrible event. The family who next owned it never really moved in. They left the place as it was, keeping the Perelsons' belongings intact. Like an eerie time capsule from the 1950s with Christmas gifts still wrapped and forgotten. Recently, the house got cleared out and is up for sale with an estimated value of millions of dollars. At number 5, the Mojave Desert. It's stunning with its unique plants, especially the Joshua tree, but sadly, some people have used this vast, beautiful land as a place to hide terrible secrets. A former sheriff deputy chief mentioned that if someone wanted to hide something awful, they might choose a place like the California desert. It's isolated, making it easier to hide dark and disturbing things. In 1984, there was this guy named William Richard Bradford who pretended to be a photographer and lured people doing something horrible to them and then burying them in the desert after removing their tattoos. He got caught for 2 of these unalivings, but he might have done even more terrible stuff because he bragged about it, saying that there were probably more victims that no one even knows about. Not too long ago in 2013, they found the remains of 4 more in these shallow graves there. At number 4 is UK's House of Horror. This Victorian mansion in UK earned the chilling nickname House of Horror after a tragic incident that took place in 2006. Christopher Lumsden, a successful law partner, committed a horrific act by fatally unaliving his wife Allison by using a blade. This act occurred after Allison disclosed her intention to leave him for a family friend. Now, despite being guilty due to diminished responsibility, Lumsden served only 2.5 years in jail. The aftermath left the mansion abandoned, falling into a state of despair, and despite its once elegant appearance with well-kept lawns and tennis courts. In 2007, a property developer purchased the house, but its grim history deterred potential buyers. Over the decade-long restoration project, the mansion underwent significant renovations, and finally, it was put on the market for £2.5 million after being restored to its former glory. At number 3 is the Villa de Vecchi, known as the Red House, which sits quietly in the Italian mountains near Lake Combo. Built in the 1800s, it was once a grand summer retreat owned by a famous count, but now it stands abandoned, its elegance faded into ruin. Now, legends tell of a ghostly presence playing the piano within its walls every night. The history, however, holds far darker events, because about 5 years after its completion, tragedy struck the count's family. His wife was found brutally unalived, and their daughter vanished as well. The count searched tirelessly for a year before unaliving himself in despair. The Red House hosted even darker events in later years. Rumors suggest that notorious occultist Aleister Crowley visited it, and his followers later conducted sinister rituals involving very gruesome things within its decaying rooms. At number 2 is Baton Rouge, which has been seeing a share of chilling stories involving serial unalivers lurking in abandoned places. Since 1997, this city has grappled with a serious issue, witnessing the loss of nearly 70 innocents at the hands of 5 different cold-hearted unalivers. It's alarming because Baton Rouge sits in Louisiana, the only state in the US with a unaliving rate exceeding 10 unalivings per 100,000 residents. And at number 1 is Lennox Castle. Lennox Castle is a place with a long history which has seen some unsettling times. Initially built for a Scottish family, it later turned into an asylum for people with mental illnesses in the 1930s. During WW2, it became a hospital, and inside those walls, fights among patients were sadly common. Imagine one brawl being so intense that staff and even innocent patients fled, leaving rioters locked inside. By the 1980s, the hospital was empty, and by 2002, it officially shut down. Now there's talk about changing the castle into apartments. Of course.
Coming in at number 1 is Joseph Mengele. Joseph Mengele was a German officer and physician during World War II. Nicknamed the Angel of Death, he performed deadly experiments on prisoners, where he was a member of the team of doctors who selected victims to die in the gas chambers, and was one of the doctors who administered the gas. One of Joseph's most chilling characteristics was his double-sided facade. He would offer sweets to the young in the camp's kindergarten, then select them as subjects for lethal experimentation. His medical experiments showed no consideration for the victim's health, safety, or physical and emotional suffering. Now, he was particularly interested in identical twins, people with heterochroma iridum, eyes of 2 different colors, dwarfs, and people with physical abnormalities. He conducted forced sterilizations of prisoners, amputated limbs, and injected chemicals in eyeballs, and once sewed Romani twins back to back. After the war, he escaped justice and lived out the rest of his life in Argentina and Paraguay, and he was never held accountable for the atrocious acts he committed. Number 9. Ilya Anovich. Ilya Anovich was a Russian biologist who worked in artificial insemination. Ilya then wanted to get of animals and put it into different species to see what happened. He started off slowly creating a Z-donk from a zebra and a donkey, a rat mouse, a guinea pig mouse, and an antelope and cow. Then in 1910, he told a gathering of zoologists that he thought it could be possible to create a human-ape hybrid, often now referred to as a human Z. Now, his chance finally came after the Russian Revolution of 1917 while working at the Institute Pasteur. It was here in 1924 he was given the opportunity to work on this. In 1926, he and Serge Vonaroff transplanted a human ovary into a chimp before attempting to inseminate her with human sperm. He attempted this 2 more times without success, so he then pitched an alternative approach. Take chimpanzees and implant it into African women without their knowledge or consent. Now, the plan was to pretend the insemination of a chimpanzee was merely a medical examination, letting them find out months afterwards when they gave birth to an exceptionally hairy and suspiciously good at climbing baby. Yeah. Now, thankfully, the French governor said no to the idea, but Ilya traveled further with 20 apes and was able to convince people to go along with it. 5 women or more volunteered for his experiment. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, no ape survived long enough at the ape nursery, and though he had women, Ilya found himself out of space. Now, before he could ship in more, the Soviet Academy of Sciences heard about his plans to inseminate women in Africa without consent, and all support for the project was taken away. Number 8. Shiro Ishii. Shiro Ishii was a Japanese war criminal, microbiologist, and army medical officer. He was the director of Unit 731, a biological warfare unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. He led the development and application of biological weapons during the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1945, including the bubonic plague attacks of Chinese cities, and planned the Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night biological attack against the United States. Ishii and his colleagues also engaged in human experimentation, resulting in the deaths of over 10,000 subjects. Experiments led under his command included vivisection of living people. Prisoners had limbs amputated and reattached to other parts of their body. Some prisoners had parts of their bodies frozen and thawed to study the resulting untreated gangrene, and humans were also used as living test cases for grenades and flamethrowers, and they were injected with strains of diseases disguised as vaccinations to study their effects. Now, for some reason, Ishii was later granted immunity in the International Military Tribunal for the Far East by the United States government in exchange for information and research for the U.S. Biological Warfare Program. Now, Ishii's immunity deal was concluded in 1948, and he was never prosecuted for any war crimes or crimes against humanity, and his exact whereabouts or occupation were unknown. Number 7. Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was a Chinese politician, communist philosopher, military strategist, and revolutionary who was the founder of the People's Republic of China, PRC, which he led as the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party from the establishment of the PRC in 1949 until his death in 1976. Mao sought to protect China from foreign influence and grow China's agricultural and industrial power through a program called the Giant Leap Forward. Now, unfortunately, this initiative was a huge failure that caused widespread famine and economic collapse. Then, Mao's government tried to cover up the failure. Anyone who spoke out against the program was labeled as a right opportunist and would be arrested or have their life ended. In the end, over 45 million people died under his leadership. Now hey, there's nothing wrong with owning up to your mistakes, and I think that's something Mao should have done instead of trying to just gaslight everyone. Number 6. Elizabeth Báthory. Elizabeth Báthory was a Hungarian noblewoman and alleged serial slayer from the family who owned land in the Kingdom of Hungary, now Slovakia. Elizabeth and 4 of her servants were accused of tormenting and ending the lives of hundreds of girls and women between 1590 and 1610. Her servants were put on trial and convicted, whereas Elizabeth was imprisoned within the castle of Sajay. Michael Farron, a writer, said in 1999 that the accusations against Elizabeth were supported by testimony from more than 300 individuals, some of whom described physical evidence and the presence of mutilated, dead, dying, and imprisoned girls found at the time of her arrest. Now, stories about Elizabeth, though, then quickly became part of national folklore. Legends describing her vampiric tendencies, such as the tale that she bathed in the blood of virgins to retain her youth, were generally recorded years after her death. Number 5. Francisco Macias Nguema. Francisco Macias Nguema is viewed as one of the most brutal dictators in history. Under his rule, Equatorial Guinea was nicknamed Dachu of Africa. According to historians, Francisco may have been a psychopath as he suffered from mental illness and suffered psychological trauma as a child. Now, some of his evil reign is that on Christmas Eve 1969, Francisco had 186 suspected dissidents executed in the National Football Stadium in Malabo as amplifiers were playing Mary Hopkins' song "Those Were the Days." 150 of the dissidents were shot or hanged, and the others were forced to dig ditches in which they were buried up to their necks and eaten alive by red ants over the next few days. As time went on, Francisco became incredibly paranoid, which included mandating the death of those who wore glasses, banning the use of the word intellectual, and destroying boats to stop his people from fleeing from his rule, and fishing was banned. He was known to order entire villages to die just to eliminate one suspected dissident. His prisons, most importantly Black Beach, were notorious for human rights abuse, as prisoners were humiliated, starved, tormented, and had their lives ended without due process. Number 4. Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold II of Belgium was the second king of the Belgians from 1865 to 1909 and the founder and sole owner of the Congo Free State from 1885 to 1908. Disguised his work and made it seem humanitarian, whereas he had sinister motives and was using forced labor to move Congolese resources. Leopold II took ownership of Congo and treated it like his personal property, as he referred to himself as the proprietor, and in an attempt to govern the people and their land, all sorts of inhuman and unthinkable methods were used. Now, sadly, Congo was looted and exploited for its natural resources, ivory, and rubber. Leopold II was a brutal slave master, and by the time he was done with Congo, the country had lost a lot of its people. Now, otherwise known as the Butcher of the Congo, Leopold II constantly enslaved and exploited the people, and the people were forced to work without pay, and he would amputate the hands of men, women, and the young when the quota of rubber was not met. By the end of his rule, about half of the population was dead. Number 3. Rafael Trujillo Molina. Rafael Trujillo Molina was a Dominican dictator who ruled the Dominican Republic from August 1930 until his assassination in May 1961. He served as president from 1930 to 1938 and again from 1942 to 1952, ruling for the rest of the time as an unelected military strongman under figurehead presidents. Now, his rule of 31 years is considered one of the bloodiest and most corrupt regimes in the Western Hemisphere and centered around a personality cult of the ruling family. Raphael's security forces were responsible for as many as 50,000 deaths. His domestic policy was built on terror, fear, and total compliance with his will. People called him El Jefe, the chief or the boss, and were utterly obedient towards him and his regime. Resistance was dealt with harshly, and any rebel usually ended up disappearing from the face of the earth. He also hated Haitians, and he ended the lives of every immigrant who was brave enough to speak negatively about the regime and Dominican Republic outside of the country. Almost nobody was safe in their asylum, and no Dominican citizen could leave the country without Raphael's permission. He simply knew everything about everyone and was like a big brother figure. Number 2. Caligula, the third Roman emperor. Ruling the Roman Empire from 37 to 41 AD, Caligula was known to be sadistic, wild, and extravagant. In the first 3 months of his reign, he had 160,000 animals sacrificed. Later, he caught a brain fever, and he was known to be mentally ill, believing he was a god. He felt prisoners should know a very painful death and began to end people's lives by causing them as much pain as possible. Many prisoners were fed to the caged wild panthers, lions, and bears, and if he disliked a gladiator, he would beat them over days until they died. Now, he was known to be so cruel that people would end their own lives rather than face him and his slow, lingering deaths. He also forced husbands to give him their wives, and he himself committed unethical practices with his sisters. And coming at number 1 is Idi Amin. Idi Amin was a Ugandan military officer and politician who served as the 3rd president of Uganda from 1971 to 1979. Now, he ruled as a military dictator and is considered one of the most brutal despots in modern world history. In addition to having his political rivals and government officials taken out, he also turned on ordinary civilians as farmers, students, and even religious figures. Amin would order public executions by firing squad for anyone he felt was plotting against his regime, and even had them televised. He'd have all of his victims' bodies tossed into the Nile, literally creating a bloodbath, and bodies were constantly seen floating down the Nile from Uganda, and at times a dam on Lake Victoria would be so clogged by bodies that it would cause power outages. Now, Amin was also rumored to have kept some of his victims' heads in his refrigerator and eat human body parts. His former health minister, Henry Kebi, said, "On several occasions, he told me quite proudly that he had eaten the organs or flesh of his human victims. He was quoted as saying, 'It's not for me, I tried human flesh, and it's too salty for my taste.'"
And we're starting off the list with the Conjure chest, which first belonged to a slave owner by the name of Jeremiah Graham. Jeremiah Graham, in anticipation of his sons, tasked a slave named Remus with constructing the chest. He was displeased with Remus's work, so he subjected Remus to a brutal and fatal beating. In response to Remus's unjust death, other enslaved individuals sought revenge, sprinkling dried owl blood inside the chest and placing a curse on it. Jeremiah Graham's son would die during infancy, and this was only the beginning of a pattern of misfortune associated with the chest. A series of owners experienced untimely deaths and hardships while in its possession, 18 to be exact. Anyone who put their clothing inside it seemed to die, putting this chest firmly into the cursed item category. If you are enjoying our channel so far, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. We have awesome videos coming at you on the daily. Number 9. Charles Manson's hair. Yes, locks of his hair have been known to sell online for hundreds of dollars. This guy doesn't really need much introduction, but for those few who do need some context, Charles Manson was a notorious cult leader who orchestrated a series of heinous crimes in the late 60s. In August of '69, Manson directed his followers, often referred to as the Manson family, to carry out a brutal spree in Los Angeles. On his orders, they took the life of actress Sharon Tate and 4 others at her residence. The following night, the Manson family were responsible for the deaths of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in similarly a gruesome fashion. So these crimes led Manson and several of his followers to being arrested, tried, and convicted. And in 1971, Manson, along with several of his followers, were sentenced to life in prison for their crimes. Over the years, items associated with him have become these kind of macabre collector's items, often selling for significant sums of money online. Again, for instance, locks of his hair, which were reported to have been sold for as much as $800. There's even like half-eaten food that he was eating in jail that's sold online. Crazy. Number 8. German World War II artifacts. This probably doesn't need much explanation. The SS committed heinous acts under the rule of Adolf Hitler, and after the Second World War, countless artifacts were left over, from uniforms and pendants to far more immediately sinister items like ceremonial daggers. On the other end, you have concentration camp uniforms, which serve as these somber relics of the suffering endured by countless innocent people in the regime's detention and extermination camps. Scary artifacts also include the helmets worn by the SS soldiers, symbols of oppression and violence. These helmets were a common sight during the regime's aggressive military campaigns, conquests, and finally, there's the propaganda posters and literature filled with hate-filled messages and indoctrination. Number 7, the Codex Gigas, aka the Devil's Bible. So this massive-sized book is said to have been written with the assistance of Lucifer himself. The Codex Gigas, believed to have been written between 1204 and 1230, changed hands several times before finding its current home in Sweden's National Library in 1768. So this ancient manuscript contains both the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, along with a whole bunch of other information from its era, but it's the inclusion of magic spells and a striking image of the devil that contribute to its reputation as a cursed item. Legend has it that the Codex Gigas was authored by a monk who had broken his vows and was facing a death sentence. In a desperate bid to save his life, though, the monk ended up making a pact with the devil. He had been tasked with a Herculean task to transcribe all human knowledge in a single night. So with the devil's assistance, the monk completed this seemingly impossible task, but the price was his soul. The demonic portrait within the Codex Gigas is said to be the devil's own signature of sorts, and there's other versions where it was possibly drawn by the monk himself as a tribute to the devil. Number 6, the Dybbuk box. The Dybbuk box is a supposedly cursed and evil item with a controversial history. It was a wine cabinet that gained notoriety after being listed on eBay in 2003. According to the story, the box was said to be haunted by a malevolent spirit known as a Dybbuk. A Dybbuk is a malicious spirit in Jewish folklore that can possess and control the actions of a living person. The box's haunted history includes reports of strange and unsettling events endured by the people who have owned it. Extreme nightmares, health issues, financial misfortune. The box gained widespread attention when it was purchased by a university museum director, Jason Haxton. He experienced various disturbing incidents and decided to research its history. The story became even more popular by a 2012 horror film, The Possession, which was loosely based on the Dybbuk box. In at number 5, we have Ed Gein's creations, to which there were many. Born in 1906 in Wisconsin, Gein was a reclusive, disturbed man. He came to the attention of law enforcement in 1957 when he was arrested for the disappearance of a local woman, Bernice Warden. When cops searched Gein's property, they discovered a horrifying collection of artifacts. Gein had fashioned lampshades, belts, and a variety of other items using human skin, and he had preserved various body parts, including heads and organs, in his home. Gein's actions were inspired by this morbid obsession he had with his deceased mother. Anyway, he was found guilty of his disturbing crimes and declared legally insane. Gein spent the rest of his life in a mental institution until his death in 1984. As to where all these disgusting items are now, they burned in a fire. His collection was going to be sold at an auction, but coincidentally, his home burned down in a fire the night before the auction was going to take place. Seems as if someone didn't think it would be right for anyone to profit off of these items, which I 100% agree with. Number 4, Ted Bundy's Volkswagen Beetle. Ted Bundy was a notorious American criminal who confessed to taking the lives of more than 30 women during the 70s. He lured many of his victims by pretending to be injured and asking for help, often approaching them in his nondescript Volkswagen Beetle. This car, a 1968 Volkswagen Beetle, which is now displayed at the Alcatraz East Crime Museum. Bundy's crimes were characterized by extreme brutality, including SA. He would often use his charm to gain the trust of his victims before attacking them. Bundy's spree spanned multiple states, and he managed to evade capture for several years. The Volkswagen Beetle became infamous as Bundy's vehicle of choice during his rampage, served as a key element in his methods, allowing him to approach and subdue his victims. And the car's inconspicuous appearance, at least for the time, made it easier for Bundy to blend in and avoid suspicion. Bundy was finally apprehended, though, and tried and sentenced to death in 1979. Next on the list is the Woman from Lem statue. Discovered in 1878 on the Mediterranean island of Cyprus and estimated to date back around 3000 BCE, the figurine depicts a seated female figure with her hands on her stomach and is made of limestone. Legend has it that the curse of the Woman of Lem was unleashed when the statue was first removed from its original location. And according to the lore, those who possess or handle the statue experience a string of unfortunate events, accidents, financial ruin, and even death, earning the statue the ominous nickname Goddess of Death. Every owner of the statue reportedly lost their life, or several family members, within a short time span after acquiring it, and the curse persisted through generations, leading to the last owners leaving the statue to their two sons, who, in an attempt to break the cycle of tragedy, eventually donated it to a museum. Even within the museum, though, the curse appeared to still have a bit of an effect, as museum's curator reportedly met an untimely demise soon after receiving it. And at number 2, we have Bisbee's Stoop Chair. In 1702 in North Yorkshire, UK, Thomas Bisbee was arrested for taking the life of his father-in-law. The two had been running a coin counterfeiting business, and during a heated argument about the direction of their illegal business venture, Bisbee took things too far, resulting in the other man's death. Bisbee was put on death row, but his last request was to have a final meal and drink at his favorite pub. Outside of this pub sat the now infamous chair, a chair that Bisbee would always sit on. On this day, though, while drunk, he cursed the chair out loud, claiming that whoever would sit in it from that day forth would be met with terrible misfortune. And over the years, some strange occurrences took place, including untimely deaths, which some attributed to the supposedly cursed chair. It's now held in Thirsk Museum, hung on the ceiling so that no one can try their hand at sitting in it. Finally, though, we have Pogo the Clown. This is a painting by the notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy had the facade of a happy, innocent man, entertaining children at parties as his Pogo the Clown character, but behind closed doors, he was nothing like what he seemed. He was a true monster. Between 1972 and 78, Gacy took the lives of 33 boys in the most sickening way possible. He would bury their bodies under his home in Norwood Park Township. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 1980, and while on death row, he took to painting. His most famous work is this painting of his alter ego, Pogo the Clown, dated 1985. I don't know why anyone would want this thing in their home, but the piece recently sold for $12,000 at an art auction in Las Vegas called Dark Shadows. Not only does the context make this thing incredibly unsettling, but it's also a gaudy, horrendous piece of crap. Anyway.